Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Anne of Bohemia, the beloved medieval queen who brought mercy and kindness to England during one of its most turbulent centuries. Born as an imperial princess in the golden city of Prague, Anne would travel across Europe to become the cherished wife of England's King Richard II, earning the enduring title of Good Queen Anne through her gentle intercessions and compassionate heart. We'll softly explore her childhood in the magnificent Prague Castle, her perilous journey across storm-tossed seas, her tender love story with the young English king, and her quiet but profound influence on religious reform and English culture, from her marriage in 1382 to her tragic death from plague in 1394, all while she navigated the complex world of medieval politics with grace and devotion. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about which historical figure you'd like to hear about next, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 14th century lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Anne, later known as Queen Anne of Bohemia, later known as the first wife of King Richard II of England, later known as Good Queen Anne, was born on the 11th day of May in the year 1366. Within the strong stone walls of Prague Castle, high above the winding Vltava river that flowed through the heart of Bohemia. The exact hour of her birth is lost to history, but we can imagine that it took place in one of the grand chambers of the castle complex, perhaps with the spring sunshine streaming through tall windows, perhaps with the sound of church bells ringing out across the city below to announce the arrival of another imperial child. The castle itself was not merely a fortress, but a symbol of imperial power and cultural refinement, a sprawling complex of buildings that had grown over centuries on its commanding hilltop position. From the castle walls, one could see the entire city of Prague spread out below, the red-tiled roofs of houses and churches, the spires and towers rising toward the sky, the great stone bridge crossing the river, the marketplaces and squares where merchants from across Europe gathered to trade their wares. The castle was the heart of Bohemia, and in 1366, Bohemia was at the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Anne's father was none other than Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, perhaps the most powerful monarch in all of Europe at that time. Charles was not merely a warrior or a ruler, but a true Renaissance figure before the Renaissance, a man of learning, culture, diplomatic skill, and grand vision. He had been born in Prague in 1316, 50 years before Anne's birth, with the Czech name Václav, later taking the name Charles in honor of his uncle, King Charles IV of France. From his early youth, Charles had been groomed for greatness. He had spent 7 years at the French court as a child, receiving an education that few princes of his era could match. He emerged from this education speaking 5 languages fluently: Latin, the language of learning and diplomacy; Czech, the language of his Bohemian subjects; German, the language of the Holy Roman Empire; French, the language of culture and courtly refinement; and Italian, the language of trade and Renaissance humanism. Charles had become King of Bohemia in 1346, at the age of 30, following the death of his father, John of Luxembourg, who had died heroically but foolishly at the Battle of Crécy, charging into English arrows despite being completely blind. Charles himself had been wounded at Crécy, fighting alongside his father, but he had survived and retreated when it became clear the battle was lost. Where his father had been reckless and romantic, Charles was calculating and pragmatic. He understood that power in the medieval world came not primarily from military conquest, but from skillful diplomacy, strategic marriages, careful accumulation of territories and titles, and the patient building of institutions that would outlast any individual ruler. In 1355, 9 years after becoming King of Bohemia, Charles had travelled to Rome and been crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Innocent VI. This made him, at least in theory, the successor to Charlemagne, the supreme secular ruler of Western Christendom, the protector of the Church, the paramount lord over hundreds of princes, bishops, counts, and free cities throughout the German lands and beyond. In practice, the Holy Roman Empire was a complex and often chaotic patchwork of semi-independent territories, each with its own ruler and its own interests, and the emperor's actual power was limited. But Charles had made the most of his position, using his imperial authority to expand his family's direct holdings, to found institutions, to patronize learning and the arts, and most importantly, to transform Prague into one of the great cities of Europe. Anne's mother was Elizabeth of Pomerania, Charles's fourth wife. Charles had been married 3 times before, and each marriage had been carefully calculated to bring political advantages or territorial gains. His first wife, Blanche of Valois, had been the half-sister of King Philip VI of France, strengthening the ties between Bohemia and France. She had died in 1348 during the Black Death, that terrible plague that had swept across Europe and killed perhaps 1/3 of its population. Charles's second wife, Anne of Bavaria, had brought alliance with the powerful Wittelsbach family. She died in 1353. His third wife, Anna von Schweidnitz, had brought the important territory of Schweidnitz in Silesia into the Bohemian crown lands. She had died in 1362, just 4 years before Anne's birth. Elizabeth of Pomerania, whom Charles married in 1363, came from a noble family in northeastern Europe. Her father was Duke Bogislaw V of Pomerania, and her mother was Elizabeth of Poland, making Elizabeth a granddaughter of Casimir the Great, King of Poland. This marriage connected the House of Luxembourg to the powerful royal and noble families of Eastern Europe. Elizabeth was much younger than Charles. She was born around 1347, making her about 16 years old when she married the 47-year-old emperor. But such age differences were entirely normal in medieval royal marriages, where political considerations far outweighed matters of romantic compatibility or personal preference. From this marriage came several children. Anne, born in 1366, was the eldest daughter. 2 years after Anne came a son, Sigismund, born in 1368. Sigismund would eventually become Holy Roman Emperor himself, reigning from 1411 to 1437, though his reign would be marked by the Hussite Wars in Bohemia and by his role in condemning the religious reformer Jan Hus to be burned at the stake. Another son, John, was born in 1369, and a younger daughter, Margaret, was born later and would eventually marry and become the Burgravin of Nuremberg. But Anne also had older half-siblings from her father's previous marriages. From Charles's first marriage to Blanche of Valois had come Margaret, who became Queen of Hungary, and Catherine, who married first Rudolph IV of Austria and then Otto V of Bavaria. From Charles's third marriage to Anna von Schweidnitz had come Wenceslaus, born in 1361, who would become King of Bohemia and King of the Romans, and Elizabeth, who died young. So Anne grew up in a large, complex, blended family, surrounded by half-siblings and full siblings, in an environment where every child understood that they were not merely individuals, but representatives of their dynasty, potential tools of diplomacy, living chess pieces in the great game of European politics. The Prague into which Anne was born was experiencing what historians would later call a golden age, a flowering of art, architecture, learning, and prosperity that transformed the Bohemian capital into one of Europe's most magnificent cities. This transformation was almost entirely the work of Anne's father, Charles IV, who had made the deliberate decision to make Prague the permanent capital of the Holy Roman Empire, rather than following the traditional pattern of having the emperor move constantly from place to place. Charles wanted Prague to rival Rome itself, to become a new Rome that would be both the political center of the empire and a showcase of Christian civilization. To achieve this vision, Charles had initiated an ambitious program of construction and urban development. In 1348, the year he became King of Bohemia, Charles had founded the new town of Prague, a carefully planned urban expansion that added significantly to the city's size and population. The new town was laid out in a grid pattern with broad streets and large squares, following the most advanced principles of medieval urban planning. The largest of these squares, now called Charles Square, was designed to hold vast crowds during religious festivals and imperial celebrations. It was here that Charles would display his extensive collection of holy relics to the public, and contemporary accounts tell us that crowds of 100,000 people would gather for these displays, an enormous number for the medieval period, suggesting that Prague had become a major pilgrimage destination as well as a political capital. In that same year of 1348, Charles had founded Charles University, the first university in Central Europe. This was an institution modelled on the great universities of Paris and Bologna, offering instruction in the liberal arts, theology, law, and medicine. The establishment of a university gave Prague intellectual prestige and attracted scholars from across Europe. Young men came to study in Prague's lecture halls, to debate in its academic disputations, to copy manuscripts in its scriptoriums. The presence of the university meant that Prague was not merely a centre of political power, but also a centre of learning and intellectual life. The most visible symbol of Charles's ambition for Prague was the construction of St. Vitus Cathedral. The foundation stone had been laid in 1344, and construction had continued throughout Anne's childhood and beyond. The cathedral was designed in the latest Gothic style, with soaring pointed arches, flying buttresses, vast expanses of stained glass, and an overall sense of reaching upward toward heaven. The architect was Matthias of Arras, who had been trained in the tradition of French Gothic cathedral building, and after his death, the work was continued by Peter Parler, a master builder from the German lands who brought his own innovations to the design. The cathedral was intended to serve as the coronation church for Bohemian kings, as the repository for the royal crown jewels, and as a fitting final resting place for Charles himself and other members of the royal family. By the time of Anne's birth in 1366, the cathedral was still under construction, and she would have grown up with the constant sounds of stonemasons' hammers and chisels echoing across the castle complex. Another of Charles's great building projects was the stone bridge across the Vltava River, construction of which had begun in 1357, 9 years before Anne's birth. The old wooden Judith Bridge had been destroyed by flooding, and Charles commissioned a magnificent stone replacement. The new bridge, which would eventually be called Charles Bridge, was a marvel of medieval engineering, more than 500 meters long, supported by 16 massive stone arches, wide enough for cart traffic and pedestrians to pass comfortably. The bridge connected the old town on the east bank with the lesser town and the castle district on the west bank. Building it took decades, continuing well past Charles's death, and even past Anne's death, but it became one of Prague's most iconic landmarks and remains so to this day. Charles also built or expanded several castles in the Bohemian countryside. The most famous was Karlstein Castle, begun in 1348 and completed in 1365, just a year before Anne's birth. Karlstein was designed as a secure repository for the imperial crown jewels, royal treasures, and Charles's collection of holy relics. It was built in the Gothic style with massive fortified towers and elaborately decorated interior chambers. The Chapel of the Holy Cross at Karlstein was particularly magnificent, with walls covered in semi-precious stones and more than 200 medieval panel paintings. Charles would retreat to Karlstein for periods of prayer and contemplation, and the castle represented his deeply held belief that political power should be united with religious devotion. Beyond his building projects, Charles was an active patron of the arts. He commissioned illuminated manuscripts, religious artworks, panel paintings, and sculptures. The court of Prague became a center of what art historians call the International Gothic style, characterized by elegant figures, rich colors, intricate detail, and a certain courtly refinement that appealed to sophisticated noble patrons. Artists from France, Italy, the German lands, and Bohemia itself gathered in Prague, creating a cosmopolitan artistic community that produced works of remarkable beauty and technical skill. Charles was also deeply interested in religious relics, believing that these physical objects, bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, thorns from Christ's crown, fragments of holy garments, had spiritual power and provided a connection between the earthly and heavenly realms. He acquired relics through purchase, through diplomatic gifts, and through his own travels. His collection grew to include hundreds of items, which he would display publicly during major religious festivals. To medieval people, these relic displays were not merely curiosities, but profound spiritual experiences, opportunities to be in the presence of sanctity, to pray before objects that had touched or been touched by the saints in paradise. Under Charles's rule, Prague's population grew significantly, perhaps reaching 50,000 inhabitants by the time of Anne's birth, a very large number for a medieval city. The city attracted merchants, craftsmen, scholars, artists, pilgrims, and adventurers from across Europe and beyond. You could hear half a dozen languages spoken in Prague's marketplaces. Italian merchants brought fine fabrics and spices from the Mediterranean. German craftsmen settled in the city's workshops and guilds. Jewish communities established themselves in Prague and contributed to its commercial and intellectual life. Students from Poland, Hungary, and other lands came to study at the university. The city hummed with activity and prosperity. This, then, was the Prague of Anne's childhood, a city at the height of its golden age, a capital of learning and art, a showcase of Gothic architecture, a center of imperial power. Anne grew up literally at the center of this world, in Prague Castle itself, the residence of the emperor and his family. The castle complex was vast, containing not only the royal residence, but also the developing cathedral, several churches and chapels, administrative buildings where the business of the kingdom was conducted, stables and workshops, gardens and courtyards. It was like a small city within the larger city, a self-contained world of power and privilege. For young Anne, growing up in this environment meant being surrounded by beauty, ceremony, and learning from her earliest years. She would have been attended by ladies-in-waiting, by servants and nurses, by tutors and chaplains. As a princess of the imperial family, She received an education that was extraordinary for a woman of any era, medieval or otherwise. She learned to read and write, skills that were far from universal even among the nobility in the 14th century. More remarkably, she learned to read and write in 3 languages: Czech, the language of her Bohemian homeland; German, the primary language of the Holy Roman Empire; and Latin, the universal language of learning, diplomacy, law, and the Church throughout Western Europe. This multilingual education would serve Anne well in later life. Latin allowed her to read scripture, religious texts, and learned works in their original forms. It allowed her to communicate with clergy, scholars, and diplomats from across Europe. Since Latin was the common tongue of educated people, regardless of their native language, German was essential for functioning in the Holy Roman Empire and for communicating with the many German-speaking subjects and nobles within the empire. Czech connected her to her Bohemian heritage and to the common people of Prague and Bohemia, allowing her to understand their language and culture rather than remaining isolated in an aristocratic foreign language bubble. Contemporary sources tell us that Anne possessed copies of the scriptures in these 3 languages: Czech, German, and Latin. This was almost unheard of for a woman of her time. The Bible was usually available only in Latin, and even that was primarily accessible to clergy. Translations into vernacular languages like Czech or German were rare and sometimes viewed with suspicion by church authorities, who worried that allowing ordinary people to read scripture without proper clerical guidance might lead to heresy or misunderstanding. For a woman to own vernacular Bibles was even more unusual, since women were generally discouraged from too much theological learning or independent scripture study. Yet Anne apparently had access to these texts and studied them, developing the deep personal piety that would characterize her entire life. We can imagine young Anne in the private chambers of Prague Castle, perhaps sitting by a window overlooking the city, with a precious manuscript open before her, carefully reading the words of the Gospel or the Psalms. These books would have been handwritten on parchment, beautifully illuminated with colored inks and gold leaf, bound in leather or wood covered with leather, perhaps decorated with jewels or metalwork. Each page would have been created with painstaking care by scribes and illuminators working for months or even years to produce a single volume. For Anne to have not 1 but 3 different versions of Scripture in 3 different languages suggests both the wealth of her family and the seriousness with which her religious education was taken. Anne's religious education was not merely about learning to read Scripture, however. She would also have been taught prayers, catechism, the lives of the saints, the liturgy of the Church, the proper conduct expected of a Christian princess. She would have attended Mass regularly, probably daily, in one of the many chapels within Prague Castle. She would have observed the great festivals of the Christian year, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and numerous feast days of saints. She would have seen religious processions, heard chanted liturgies, smelled the incense that filled the churches during services, experienced the elaborate ceremonies that marked medieval Christian worship. She would also have received instruction in the practical skills expected of a noble lady. She would have learned embroidery and needlework, skills that were not merely decorative, but also practically useful and considered appropriately feminine. She might have learned some music, perhaps singing, possibly playing simple instruments. She would have been taught the proper manners and deportment expected of someone of her rank, how to conduct herself in formal situations, how to speak appropriately to different levels of society, how to manage servants and households. She would have learned about the complex hierarchies of medieval society, understanding her place within them and the responsibilities that came with high birth. As Anne grew from a small child into a young girl, she would have become increasingly aware of the world beyond Prague Castle. She would have seen the constant flow of visitors to her father's court, ambassadors from foreign kingdoms, bishops and abbots from across the empire, nobles coming to seek favors or to present petitions, merchants offering valuable goods for purchase, scholars seeking patronage, artists hoping for commissions. She would have witnessed the elaborate ceremonies that marked the rhythms of imperial life: coronations, royal weddings, religious festivals, diplomatic receptions, feasts and banquets where hundreds of guests would gather in the great halls of the castle. She would also have become aware, as she grew older, of the political realities that shaped her world. The Holy Roman Empire was not a unified nation-state like modern countries, but rather a complex collection of territories, each with its own degree of independence, bound together by networks of feudal obligations, family relationships, and traditional customs. The emperor's power was real but limited. He could grant titles and privileges. He could summon imperial assemblies. He could raise armies and wage wars. But he could not simply command obedience from all his nominal subjects. Much of medieval politics consisted of negotiation, persuasion, strategic marriages, carefully crafted alliances, and the patient accumulation of power through multiple channels. Anne would have learned that she herself was a potential tool of this diplomacy. Medieval princesses were valuable commodities in the marriage market. A well-negotiated royal marriage could seal an alliance between kingdoms, end a war, secure a dynasty's claim to contested territories, or bring substantial wealth in the form of a dowry. Princesses had little or no choice in whom they would marry. Such decisions were made by their families based on political calculations. The best a princess could hope for was that she would be married to someone who would treat her kindly, and that her marriage would bring benefits to her natal family and her new family alike. Anne also had the example of her older half-sisters to observe. Margaret, her father's daughter from his first marriage, had been married to Louis I of Hungary, becoming Queen of Hungary. Catherine, another half-sister, had married Rudolph IV, Duke of Austria, creating an alliance with the powerful Habsburg family. After Rudolph's death, Catherine had married again, this time to Otto V of Bavaria. These marriages had brought the House of Luxembourg important alliances with neighbouring powers. Anne would have understood that a similar fate likely awaited her: marriage to some foreign prince or king, departure from her beloved Prague, a life in a strange land among strange people, all in service to her family's political interests. But in her early childhood, such thoughts were probably distant. Anne was simply a child growing up in one of Europe's most magnificent cities, in one of its most cultured courts, surrounded by beauty and learning. She played with her siblings, learned her lessons from her tutors, attended religious services, and gradually absorbed the complex web of knowledge, skills, customs, and expectations that would shape her future role. The year 1378 brought a great change to Anne's life and to the entire Bohemian kingdom. On the 29th of November of that year, her father, Emperor Charles IV, died at Prague Castle. He was 62 years old, an advanced age for the medieval period, when life expectancy was much shorter than in modern times. Charles had been suffering from gout and other ailments in his later years, and he had contracted pneumonia that proved fatal. His death was not unexpected. He had been preparing for it, settling his affairs, making provision for the succession, but it was nonetheless a momentous event. Charles IV had ruled Bohemia for 32 years and had held the imperial crown for 23 years. During his reign, he had transformed Prague into one of Europe's great cities, had accumulated vast territories for his family, had founded a university and commissioned magnificent buildings, had collected holy relics and patronized artists, had issued the Golden Bull of 1356 that defined the constitutional structure of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries to come. He was widely respected as a wise and effective ruler, a man who had brought prosperity and prestige to his lands through intelligence and diplomacy, rather than through military conquest alone. The grief at Charles's death was genuine and widespread. His body was laid out in state first at Prague Castle, then at 3 different churches in Prague, allowing thousands of his subjects to pay their respects. The funeral ceremonies were elaborate and lengthy, reflecting Charles's high status and the genuine affection in which he was held. He was buried beneath the main altar of St. Vitus Cathedral, the great Gothic church whose construction he had overseen, in a tomb that had been prepared during his lifetime. At the funeral, the Czech theologian and philosopher Adalbertus Ranconis de Ericinio gave an oration in which he called Charles Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, a title that would stick and that Czechs still use for Charles today, more than 600 years after his death. For Anne, who was 12 years old at the time of her father's death, this must have been a traumatic experience. Charles had been a dominating presence in her life, the source of stability and security, the great figure around whom the entire world of Prague Castle seemed to revolve. Now he was gone, and the future was uncertain. Her older half-brother Wenceslaus, who was 17 years old, inherited the Bohemian crown and the position of King of the Romans, the designated heir to the imperial title. But Wenceslaus lacked his father's skills and temperament. Where Charles had been hard-working, diplomatic, and pragmatic, Wenceslaus was more impulsive, less interested in the grinding work of administration, more prone to act on passion than on careful calculation. History would not be kind to Wenceslaus. His reign as King of Bohemia would be troubled by conflicts with the nobility, by religious tensions, and by his own personal failings. He would eventually be deposed as Holy Roman Emperor, an almost unprecedented humiliation, though he would continue to rule Bohemia until his death in 1419. His inability to live up to his father's legacy would contribute to instability in the empire and would eventually play a role in the religious upheavals that would shake Bohemia in the 15th century. But in 1378, all of that was in the future. For now, Anne simply had to adjust to life in a Prague that was no longer under the guiding hand of Charles IV. Under Wenceslaus's reign, Anne continued to live at Prague Castle, continuing her education and her religious devotions. She remained under the care and protection of her family, still a princess of the House of Luxembourg, still a potential bride whose marriage could bring advantages to Bohemia and to the empire. The castle that had been so full of purposeful activity under Charles now had a different character. Wenceslaus spent money lavishly on personal pleasures, maintained a somewhat dissolute court, and did not have his father's vision or discipline. Nevertheless, Prague remained a magnificent city, and Anne's position remained secure. For several years after her father's death, Anne's life continued in this pattern. She was growing into young womanhood, becoming more beautiful and more accomplished. Contemporary descriptions suggest that Anne was not considered a great beauty by medieval standards. She was small in stature, with delicate features, but she seems to have had a gentle and sweet disposition that made her attractive in a different way. Her education had made her unusually learned for a woman of her time. Her piety was genuine and deep. Her character was developing the gentle kindness that would later earn her such affection in England. Meanwhile, far to the west, events were unfolding that would soon dramatically change Anne's life and draw her into the complex, violent, and unstable politics of England. Meanwhile, far to the west, across the German lands and the English Channel, events were unfolding that would soon dramatically change Anne's life and draw her into the complex, violent, and unstable politics of England. To understand Anne's future, we must first understand the kingdom she would one day call home and the young man who would become her husband. England in the late 13th century and early 14th century had been a powerful and prosperous kingdom under the long reign of Edward III. Edward had come to the throne in 1327, when he was just 14 years old, and he would rule for 50 years until his death in 1377. His reign had been marked by military glory, particularly in the early decades, when English armies had won stunning victories against the French in the ongoing conflict that historians would later call the 100 Years' War. This war had begun in 1337, when Edward III had pressed his claim to the French throne. The claim was based on complex dynastic arguments involving Edward's mother, Isabella of France, who had been the daughter of King Philip IV of France. When the direct male line of French kings had died out, Edward had argued that he had a legitimate claim through his mother. The French had rejected this claim, arguing that the French crown could not pass through a woman, and they had instead crowned Philip VI, a cousin of the previous king. Edward had responded by declaring himself King of France and launching military campaigns to enforce his claim. The early campaigns of the 100 Years' War had brought spectacular English victories. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, the same battle where Anne's grandfather, John of Luxembourg, had died, an English army led by Edward III and his eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince, had defeated a much larger French army through superior tactics and the devastating effectiveness of English longbow archers. 10 years later, in 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, the Black Prince had won an even more remarkable victory, not only defeating the French army, but actually capturing King John II of France himself, who was brought back to England as a prisoner. These victories had brought England enormous prestige, substantial territorial gains in France, and massive ransoms paid for the return of captured French nobles. England in the mid-14th century seemed to be at the height of its power and glory. But this golden age would not last. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348, brought by ships from the continent, and within 2 years it had killed perhaps 1/3 or even 1/2 of England's population. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields went unploughed because there were not enough workers to till them. The economy was devastated. The social order was disrupted as surviving workers, suddenly scarce and therefore valuable, began to demand higher wages and better conditions. The plague also affected the royal family. Edward III's daughter Joan died of plague in 1348, while travelling to Spain to marry the Crown Prince of Castile. She was just 14 years old. Many nobles and common people alike died in the successive waves of plague that swept through England in 1348 and 1349, and in recurring outbreaks in subsequent years. The psychological impact was profound. People struggled to understand why God had sent such terrible punishment, and many turned to extreme religious practices, to scapegoating of outsiders, or to a kind of nihilistic despair about the future. The military situation also began to turn against England. After the initial victories of Crécy and Poitiers, the war settled into a grinding stalemate. The French, under their new king Charles V, the same Charles V who would later try to prevent Anne of Bohemia from crossing to England, adopted new tactics, avoiding pitched battles where the English longbows gave England a decisive advantage, and instead using siege warfare, raids, and a strategy of gradually reclaiming territory bit by bit. By the 1370s, much of the territory that England had gained was being lost again. English armies were suffering defeats, and the costs of maintaining garrisons in France were draining the royal treasury. Edward III's personal life also deteriorated in his later years. His beloved wife, Queen Philippa of Hainault, died in 1369, and Edward mourned her deeply. In his old age, Edward fell under the influence of a grasping mistress named Alice Perrers, who manipulated the aging king and enriched herself at the expense of the kingdom. The king's health declined. He may have suffered a series of strokes, and by the mid-1370s, he was no longer capable of ruling effectively. Power increasingly fell into the hands of his sons and advisors, and there was growing concern about what would happen when Edward finally died. The natural heir to the English throne was Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, the great military hero of Crécy and Poitiers. But the Black Prince himself was ill. He had contracted some kind of chronic disease, possibly dysentery, while campaigning in Spain in the 1360s, and his health had never fully recovered. By the early 1370s, he was spending much of his time confined to his bed, unable to lead armies or participate actively in government. He had married Joan of Kent, a beautiful and somewhat controversial noblewoman. She was known as the Fair Maid of Kent for her beauty, and she had been married twice before, making her marital history complex and scandalous by the standards of the time. From this marriage had come two sons, Edward, born in 1365, and Richard, born on the 6th of January, 1367. At the Archbishop's Palace in Bordeaux in southwestern France, where the Black Prince was serving as his father's lieutenant. The Black Prince died on the 8th of June, 1376, at the age of 45, worn out by his mysterious illness and by the disappointment of seeing the French gradually erode the gains he had won in his youth. His death was a devastating blow to England. He had been the kingdom's greatest warrior, its most celebrated hero, the embodiment of chivalric virtue and military prowess. Now he was gone, dead before his father, and England had lost the man who would have been its next king. Less than a year later, on the 21st of June, 1377, King Edward III himself died at Sheen Palace, the same palace where Anne of Bohemia would die 17 years later. Edward was 64 years old and had reigned for 50 years. His long reign had seen great triumphs and terrible disasters, military glory and plague devastation, cultural flourishing and economic crisis. Now it was over, and the question of succession had to be addressed. Normally, when a king died, his eldest son became king, but the Black Prince had predeceased his father. This meant that the crown passed to the Black Prince's eldest surviving son. Edward, the Black Prince's first son, had died in childhood. This meant that the crown would pass to Richard of Bordeaux, the Black Prince's second son, who was just 10 years old when his grandfather died. Richard was crowned King Richard II at Westminster Abbey on the 16th of July, 1377, just a few weeks after his grandfather's death. The coronation ceremony was elaborate and solemn, full of ancient ritual and religious significance. The young boy was anointed with holy oil, symbolizing that he ruled by divine right. He was given the crown, the scepter, the orb, and the other regalia of kingship. He took his seat on the throne as the Lord's anointed. King Richard II, King of England, Lord of Ireland, and claimant to the throne of France. He was 10 years old. Obviously, a 10-year-old boy could not actually rule a kingdom. Medieval people understood this, and they had developed systems for dealing with minority kingships. A regency council would be established. made up of senior nobles and advisors who would govern in the young king's name until he came of age. In Richard's case, his mother Joan of Kent served as a guardian and protector, though she did not have formal political power. The actual governance of the kingdom fell largely to Richard's uncles, the surviving sons of Edward III. The most powerful and influential of these uncles was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. John was the fourth son of Edward III. 3 older brothers had died before him, leaving John as the senior surviving prince. He was immensely wealthy, owning vast estates throughout England through his marriage to Blanche of Lancaster, heiress to the Duchy of Lancaster. John had military experience, diplomatic skill, and political ambition. He was also controversial. Many people suspected him of wanting to seize the throne for himself, and he was widely blamed for England's military failures in France and for the heavy taxes that were needed to fund the continuing war. Another of Richard's uncles was Thomas of Woodstock, who later became Duke of Gloucester. Thomas was younger than John of Gaunt and somewhat less powerful, but he was ambitious and would later become one of Richard's most formidable opponents. Yet another uncle was Edmund of Langley, who was more moderate and less politically aggressive than his brothers. These uncles, along with other senior nobles and bishops, formed the council that would govern England during Richard's minority. The situation in England during the late 1370s and early 1380s was tense and unstable. The war with France was going badly. The costs of the war were enormous. The population was still recovering from the Black Death and subsequent plague outbreaks. The economy was strained. There were social tensions between lords and peasants, between rich and poor, between different regions and different factions. And at the center of it all was a boy king who was growing up in a poisoned political atmosphere, surrounded by ambitious men who were nominally his protectors, but who often seemed more interested in their own power than in his well-being or the good of the kingdom. Richard seems to have been an intelligent and sensitive child, but also proud, stubborn, and capable of sudden fits of rage, traits that would become more pronounced as he grew older. He grew up knowing that his father, the great Black Prince, had been a legendary warrior and hero, and this created enormous expectations that Richard would never be able to fulfill. Richard was not a natural warrior. He was more interested in art, literature, fashion, and ceremony than in the rough masculine world of military campaigns. This would later be held against him by critics who thought that a king should be first and foremost a warrior. Richard's mother, Joan of Kent, was devoted to her son and tried to protect him from the intrigues and dangers of the court. She had been a controversial figure in her youth. Her first marriage had been annulled. Her second marriage had been challenged on grounds of bigamy, and she had been involved in various scandals. But as the mother of the king, she commanded respect and had real influence. Richard seems to have been very attached to his mother, and her death in 1386, when Richard was 19, would remove one of the few stabilizing influences in his life. The crisis that would define Richard's youth came in 1381, when Anne of Bohemia was 15 years old and living in Prague, still unaware that her destiny was about to become entangled with England's. This crisis was the Peasants' Revolt, one of the most dramatic popular uprisings in English medieval history. The immediate cause of the revolt was a poll tax. A poll tax was a flat-rate tax that every person over a certain age had to pay, regardless of their wealth or income. In November of 1380, Parliament had approved a poll tax of 3 groats, 12 pence, per person, to raise money for the war with France. This was the third poll tax in 4 years, and each one had been higher than the last. For wealthy people, 12 pence was a trivial sum, but for poor peasants and labourers it was a substantial burden, perhaps representing several days' wages or more. The poll tax was deeply unpopular because it was seen as fundamentally unfair. A rich merchant or noble and a poor peasant paid exactly the same amount, even though the burden fell much more heavily on the poor. This violated the medieval sense of justice, which held that people should contribute to the common good in proportion to their ability to pay. Moreover, the poll tax came at a time when ordinary people were already struggling with economic difficulties and were increasingly resentful of the demands placed on them by their lords and by the government. The underlying causes of the peasants' revolt went much deeper than just the poll tax, however. They had to do with fundamental changes in English society in the decades since the Black Death. Before the plague, England had been a society where most rural people were serfs or villeins, unfree peasants who were bound to the land and who owed various labour obligations to their lords. A serf could not leave his lord's estate without permission. He owed a certain number of days of work each year on the lord's lands. He had to pay various fees and tolls. He had limited legal rights. In return, the lord was supposed to protect the serf and provide him with land to farm for his own sustenance. But the Black Death had changed everything. With perhaps half the population dead, labour was suddenly scarce. Surviving workers realised that they were now valuable and could demand better treatment. They wanted higher wages. They wanted freedom from the old servile obligations. They wanted to be able to move from place to place to find the best employment. Lords, desperate for workers to tend their fields and perform necessary labour, often had to agree to these demands. Some lords offered cash wages instead of requiring labour service. Some lords agreed to free their serfs in exchange for money payments. But the nobility and the government tried to resist these changes. In 1351, just a few years after the Black Death, Parliament had passed the Statute of Labourers, which set maximum wages and tried to prevent workers from demanding more pay or moving from place to place to seek better employment. The law made it illegal for workers to refuse to work at the statutory wage rates or to leave their home districts in search of better opportunities. Violators could be punished with imprisonment. This law was deeply resented by ordinary people, who saw it as an attempt by the wealthy to keep them in poverty and servitude despite the changed circumstances. Tensions had been building throughout the 1370s. There were small-scale disturbances, complaints, and conflicts between lords and peasants. Some lords tried to force freed peasants back into serfdom. Some tried to enforce old dues and obligations that had fallen into disuse. Some used the courts to harass and exploit their tenants. Meanwhile, ordinary people were increasingly exposed to ideas about equality and justice through the preaching of radical clerics. One such preacher was John Ball, who travelled around the countryside giving sermons in which he asked provocative questions. When Adam delved an Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The implication was that all people were equal in God's sight, that the distinctions between nobles and commoners were human inventions rather than divine orderings, and that the current social system was unjust and contrary to God's plan. All of these underlying tensions came to a head in May of 1381, when a royal tax commissioner named John Bampton arrived in the Essex village of Fobbing to investigate why people had not paid the poll tax. Bampton was aggressive and threatening in his methods, and the villagers, led by a local landowner named Thomas Baker, responded by driving him out of town. This act of defiance quickly spread to neighbouring villages. Within days, all of Essex was in revolt. Soon, Kent was also rising. Bands of rebels began to organise to destroy manorial records that documented servile obligations, to attack the homes of unpopular officials and nobles, to free prisoners from jails. The rebels were not the absolute poor. The truly destitute rarely have the organization or resources to mount effective revolts. Rather, they were substantial peasants, small landowners, village officials, parish priests, craftsmen, and even some minor gentry. These were people who had something to lose and who resented the attempts to push them back down into servitude. They were also people who had some organizational capacity, who could read and write, who understood how the system worked and therefore knew how to challenge it effectively. By early June, rebel armies were converging on London from both Essex and Kent. The Kentish rebels were particularly well organized and were led by a man named Wat Tyler, about whom we know very little, except that he seems to have had some military experience and considerable charisma and leadership ability. The rebels' demands were remarkably radical for the time. They wanted the complete abolition of serfdom. They wanted all feudal dues and labour services to be replaced by simple cash rents at a rate of 4 pence per acre. They wanted a general pardon for all participants in the revolt. They wanted various unpopular officials to be removed from office and punished for corruption and oppression. Some of the more radical rebels wanted even more sweeping changes: redistribution of church wealth, execution of corrupt nobles and officials, fundamental restructuring of society along more egalitarian lines. The government of young King Richard II, still just 14 years old, was taken completely by surprise. The royal army was scattered across England, Scotland and France. There were not enough soldiers in or near London to suppress the revolt by force. On the 13th of June, 1381, the Kentish rebels, led by Wat Tyler, entered London. They had convinced or coerced the city authorities to open the gates, and thousands of armed peasants and craftsmen poured into the capital city. What followed was several days of chaos and violence. The rebels targeted the homes and properties of people they blamed for their grievances. They burned the magnificent Savoy Palace, the London residence of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who was widely hated as the power behind the throne and blamed for heavy taxation and military failures. They destroyed legal records and manorial rolls that documented servile obligations. They opened prisons and freed the prisoners. They hunted down unpopular officials. On Tower Hill, they seized and executed Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Lord Chancellor, whom they blamed for the poll tax. They also executed Robert Hales, the Lord Treasurer. Both men were beheaded by the mob. King Richard and his advisers took refuge in the Tower of London, the great fortress on the eastern edge of the city. From the tower's walls, they could see smoke rising from burning buildings across the city. They could hear the roar of the mob. They understood that they were in mortal danger. Richard's mother, Joan of Kent, was with him in the tower, and she was terrified. The situation seemed completely out of control. On the 14th of June, Richard made a brave decision. Despite the danger, despite the fact that he was only 14 years old, despite the pleas of some of his advisers to remain safe in the tower, Richard decided to meet with the rebels directly. He rode out to Mile End, an open area to the east of London, accompanied by only a small retinue of knights and officials. There, he met with a large group of Essex rebels and their representatives. The meeting at Mile End was remarkable. Here was the young king, barely more than a child, facing thousands of armed men who had already shown themselves willing to use violence and who had just executed some of the kingdom's highest officials. Richard could easily have been captured or killed, but instead he engaged with the rebels, listened to their demands, and made extraordinary promises. He agreed to abolish serfdom throughout England. He agreed to set a maximum rent of 4 pence per acre for land. He agreed to grant a general pardon to all who had participated in the revolt. He agreed to investigate and punish corrupt officials. He even agreed to provide royal banners, flags bearing the royal coat of arms, to each shire as a symbol of his commitment to these promises. The rebels at Mile End were satisfied. Many of them left London and returned to their homes, believing that their grievances had been addressed and that the king, whatever his evil advisers might have done, was on their side. Clerks immediately began writing out charters granting freedom and pardons with the king's seal attached. It seemed that the revolt had succeeded beyond the rebels' wildest dreams. But while Richard was at Mile End negotiating with the Essex rebels, another group of rebels, the hardcore Kentish contingent led by Wat Tyler, had stormed the Tower of London. They had forced their way inside, terrorizing the occupants, and they had dragged out and executed several more officials who had taken refuge there. Richard's mother, Joan of Kent, had to be spirited away to safety. When Richard returned from Mile End and learned what had happened, he was furious and probably frightened, but there was little he could do. The city was still full of armed rebels, and the situation remained extremely dangerous. The next day, the 15th of June, Richard agreed to meet with Wat Tyler and the Kentish rebels at Smithfield, an open area just outside the city walls. This meeting was even more tense than the one at Mile End. Wat Tyler presented even more radical demands than the Essex rebels had made. He wanted not just the abolition of serfdom, but the redistribution of church lands to the common people. He wanted equality before the law. He wanted only one bishop, presumably an end to the wealthy and powerful ecclesiastical hierarchy. He wanted no lordship except the king, presumably an end to the feudal nobility as a distinct class. These demands were revolutionary in the truest sense. They would have fundamentally transformed English society, ending the entire medieval social order of lords and peasants, clergy and laity, three estates of the realm. Richard, despite his youth, seems to have understood that these demands were impossible to grant. The meeting became heated. Wat Tyler behaved in what some chroniclers describe as an insolent or arrogant manner toward the king, perhaps deliberately testing Richard's authority. Then, in a sudden eruption of violence, William Walworth, the Lord Mayor of London, who was accompanying Richard, drew his sword and struck at Wat Tyler. Tyler was wounded and fell from his horse. The rebels, seeing their leader attacked, prepared to charge and attack the king's small retinue. At this critical moment, with violence about to explode, and with his own life in immediate danger, Richard acted with remarkable courage and presence of mind. He spurred his horse forward, riding toward the rebel army, and shouted, "Sirs, will you shoot your king? I will be your captain and your leader." This bold gesture stopped the rebels in their tracks. Richard then led them away from Smithfield to the fields of Clerkenwell, promising to address their grievances. Meanwhile, Walworth rode back into London and quickly assembled a force of armed citizens and soldiers. When he returned to Clerkenwell with this force, the rebels found themselves surrounded and outmatched. Wat Tyler, who'd been carried to a nearby hospital, was dragged out and beheaded. With their leader dead and facing a superior force, the rebels' resolve crumbled. Richard again promised pardons and reforms, and the rebel army dispersed and headed back to their homes. Over the following days and weeks, order was gradually restored in London and throughout the affected counties. But then came the reckoning. Richard's promises at Mile End and Smithfield had been made under duress, and medieval legal theory held that promises made under threat were not binding. As soon as the immediate danger had passed, Richard and his government began to revoke the charters of freedom and pardon that had been issued. Royal armies were dispatched to the rebellious counties to hunt down the ringleaders. Hundreds of people were arrested, tried in hasty courts, and executed by hanging. The rebel leaders were killed, and anyone who had played a significant role in the uprising was punished. By November of 1381, more than 1,500 people had been executed for their participation in the peasants' revolt. Serfdom was not abolished. The statute of labourers remained in force. The feudal social order continued. The poll tax was quietly dropped. It had proven too politically explosive, but otherwise, the revolt had failed to achieve its goals. Yet it had succeeded in frightening the ruling class and demonstrating that ordinary people, when pushed too far, were capable of organised resistance and even of temporarily threatening the entire social order. For young Richard, the peasants' revolt was a formative experience. At 14 years old, he had shown remarkable courage in riding out to meet armed rebels who had already executed some of the kingdom's highest officials. He had negotiated successfully, made promises that calmed the situation, and had personally intervened at a critical moment to prevent violence. These actions had won him praise and had demonstrated that, despite his youth, he was capable of leadership in a crisis. But the revolt also seems to have left Richard with certain attitudes and beliefs that would shape his later reign. He had seen the common people rise up against lawful authority. He had seen how quickly social order could break down when challenged. He had seen nobles and officials executed by mobs. These experiences may have contributed to Richard's later determination to assert royal authority strongly, to brook no challenges to his power, and to punish severely anyone who he thought was disloyal or rebellious. The revolt also demonstrated something else: the potential power of royal mercy and intercession. Richard's promises of pardons and reforms, even though they were later revoked, had been effective in diffusing the immediate crisis. This lesson, that showing mercy, or at least appearing to show mercy, could be a powerful tool of kingship, may have influenced Richard's later willingness to grant pardons at the intercession of his queen. It would be Anne of Bohemia, arriving in England just months after the revolt, who would most frequently use this tool of royal mercy, interceding for those who faced punishment and earning herself the enduring title of Good Queen Anne. It was in this context, a kingdom recovering from a major rebellion, a young king who had proven himself brave but who was still learning to rule, a political system full of ambitious nobles and uncertain about the future, that the marriage negotiations between England and Bohemia began to take shape. The marriage would be arranged not out of any romantic considerations, but purely as a matter of political and diplomatic calculation. Yet from this political arrangement would grow one of the more genuine love stories of the medieval period, and Anne of Bohemia would become a significant figure in English history, remembered with affection more than 600 years after her death. It was against this backdrop of recent rebellion and continuing political instability that the idea of a marriage between young King Richard II of England and Anne of Bohemia first began to take shape. The origins of this marriage proposal lay not in any personal connection between the two young people. They had never met, had never even seen each other, but rather in the complex diplomatic and religious politics of late 14th century Europe. The key factor that made this marriage possible, and indeed attractive to both sides, was the Great Schism in the Catholic Church, one of the most profound religious crises of the medieval period. To understand why Anne of Bohemia became Richard's bride, we must first understand this schism and its implications for European politics. For more than 1,000 years, Western Christianity had been unified under a single pope, who ruled from Rome as the successor of St. Peter and the vicar of Christ on earth. The pope's spiritual authority was theoretically absolute. He could excommunicate kings, place entire kingdoms under interdict, declare crusades, interpret doctrine, and serve as the final arbiter of religious disputes. The papal court in Rome was one of the great centres of power and wealth in medieval Europe, controlling vast territories in central Italy, known as the Papal States, receiving revenues from churches throughout Christendom, and serving as a destination for pilgrims from across the continent. But in the 14th century, this unity had been disrupted. In 1309, a French archbishop had been elected pope and had taken the name Clement V. Rather than moving to Rome as tradition dictated, Clement had established his court at Avignon in southern France. For the next 70 years, from 1309 to 1377, the popes had resided at Avignon rather than Rome. This period is sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, comparing it to the ancient captivity of the Jews in Babylon. The Avignon papacy was controversial from the start. The popes at Avignon were overwhelmingly French, and they were seen as being under the influence of the French crown. The magnificent papal palace at Avignon, with its massive walls and towers, its elaborate frescoes and ornate chambers, demonstrated the wealth and power of the papacy, but it also seemed to critics to represent worldliness and corruption rather than spiritual leadership. Reform-minded Christians argued that the Pope belonged in Rome, at the tomb of St. Peter, not in a French city under the shadow of French royal power. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI, responding to these criticisms and to the pleas of religious figures like St. Catherine of Siena, had finally moved the papal court back to Rome. But Gregory died in March of 1378, just 14 months after the return to Rome, and his death precipitated the crisis that would become the Great Schism. The cardinals who gathered in Rome to elect Gregory's successor were under intense pressure from the Roman population, who feared that another French pope would move the papacy back to Avignon. Angry crowds surrounded the Vatican, shouting, "Romano lo volemo," "We want a Roman," and threatening violence if the cardinals elected another Frenchman. Under this pressure, the cardinals elected an Italian archbishop, who took the name Urban VI. Urban VI, however, proved to be a difficult and confrontational pope. He immediately began a program of reform aimed at reducing the wealth and privileges of the cardinals and the papal court. He was harsh, inflexible, and accusatory, insulting cardinals publicly and demanding changes that threatened their power and income. Many of the cardinals, most of whom were French, came to regret their choice. They claimed that the election had been invalid because it had been conducted under pressure from the Roman mob, that they had feared for their lives, and that therefore Urban's election was not legitimate. In September of 1378, just 5 months after Urban's election, 13 of the cardinals left Rome and gathered at Anagni. There they declared Urban's election null and void and proceeded to elect a new pope. They chose Robert of Geneva, a French cardinal, who took the name Clement VII. Clement immediately moved his court back to Avignon, while Urban remained in Rome. Now there were two men, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter, each claiming to be the one true pope, each excommunicating the other and declaring the other's followers to be schismatics and heretics. This was not merely a theological dispute among clerics. It had immediate and profound political implications for every kingdom, every diocese, every monastery, and every Christian in Western Europe. Which pope should they obey? Which pope's authority should they recognize when appointing bishops, granting dispensations, collecting church revenues, or resolving religious disputes? The choice was not merely religious, but deeply political, as alliances with one pope or another could determine the course of wars, the legitimacy of rulers, and the flow of wealth and power. Europe divided along largely political lines. France, naturally, supported Clement VII at Avignon. He was French. He resided in French territory, and supporting him allowed the French crown to maintain influence over the papacy. Scotland, traditionally allied with France and hostile to England, also supported Clement. Most of Spain supported Clement as well, as did some of the Italian states. England, equally naturally, supported Urban VI in Rome. As France's enemy in the ongoing 100 Years' War, England could not support a French pope who was under French influence. Most of the German princes and the Italian states that opposed French influence also supported Urban. And crucially for our story, Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire also supported Urban. King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, Anne's brother, who was both King of Bohemia and King of the Romans, the designated Emperor-elect, had decided to support Urban VI. This decision was partly religious, partly political, and partly pragmatic. Bohemia had traditionally had strong religious connections to Rome rather than to Avignon. Wenceslaus also wanted to maintain good relations with the Italian territories that were part of the Holy Roman Empire, most of which supported Urban. And supporting the same pope as England opened up the possibility of an Anglo-Bohemian alliance that might be useful in various ways. It was Pope Urban VI himself who actively encouraged a marriage alliance between England and Bohemia. Urban understood that his position was precarious. He was opposed by most of France, by Scotland, by Castile, by Naples, and by various other powers. He needed allies. An alliance between England and the Holy Roman Empire, sealed by a royal marriage, would create a powerful bloc of support for his claim to the papacy. Urban therefore gave his blessing to the marriage negotiations and actively promoted them as part of his diplomatic strategy. The English side of the negotiations was managed primarily by Michael de la Pole, one of King Richard's most trusted advisors. De la Pole was a fascinating figure in his own right. Unlike most of the great nobles who surrounded the young king, de la Pole did not come from an ancient aristocratic lineage. His grandfather had been a merchant in Hull, a trading port in northern England, who had made a fortune in the wool trade. His father, William de la Pole, had become one of the wealthiest merchants in England and had lent substantial sums of money to King Edward III to finance his wars, receiving knighthood and royal favour in return. Michael de la Pole had inherited his father's wealth and his father's close ties to the royal court. He had served in various military and diplomatic capacities under Edward III and had become a trusted advisor to young Richard. In 1383, he would be made Earl of Suffolk, the first man of merchant rather than noble origins to be granted an earldom. De la Pole was intelligent, capable, and ambitious. He understood both finance and diplomacy. He saw in a Bohemian marriage an opportunity to create a continental alliance that could help England in its conflicts with France, and he worked tirelessly to bring the negotiations to a successful conclusion. Another key figure in the negotiations was Sir Simon Burley, who had been Richard's tutor during his youth, and who had served the royal family for decades. Burley had been a knight in the service of the Black Prince, Richard's father, and after the Black Prince's death, Burley had become one of Richard's closest companions and advisors. He was loyal, experienced, and trusted by both Richard and his mother, Joan of Kent. Burley would play a crucial role not only in negotiating the marriage, but also in the dangerous task of escorting Anne from Bohemia to England. On the Bohemian side, the negotiations were managed by King Wenceslaus and his advisors. Wenceslaus saw several advantages in the English match. It would create an alliance with England that might be useful politically and militarily. It would strengthen Bohemia's position within the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire. It would demonstrate Bohemia's importance and prestige by marrying the emperor's sister to a king. and it would help to solidify the alignment of both kingdoms with Pope Urban against the rival Pope Clement. However, the negotiations were not straightforward. There were significant obstacles that had to be overcome, and the process would take several years to complete. One major issue was the matter of the dowry. In a typical medieval royal marriage, the bride would bring a substantial dowry, money, lands, jewels, or other valuable goods, from her family to her husband's family. The dowry served several purposes. It provided the new bride with financial security, giving her resources that she could control even in her new kingdom. It also served as a form of compensation to the groom's family for taking on the responsibility and expense of supporting the bride and establishing her in royal state. And it demonstrated the wealth and prestige of the bride's family. But in the case of Anne's marriage to Richard, there would be no dowry. Anne would bring nothing to England. In fact, the financial arrangements would be reversed. England would pay Bohemia for the privilege of marrying Anne. King Richard would give King Wenceslaus 20,000 florins, an enormous sum, equivalent to perhaps £4 million in modern currency, in exchange for Anne's hand in marriage. England would also grant annuities, annual payments, to some of the Bohemian nobles and attendants who would accompany Anne to England. This unusual financial arrangement reflected the political nature of the marriage. Bohemia was not trying to enrich itself through Anne's marriage. Rather, England was essentially paying for the diplomatic benefits of an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. England was buying the prestige of having the emperor's sister as queen, buying the support of a major continental power, buying a strengthened position in the complex diplomatic chess game that was European politics in the late 14th century. But this lack of a dowry, and even more, the fact that England was paying rather than receiving payment, would become a major source of criticism within England. Many English nobles, members of Parliament, and ordinary people felt that this was a terrible bargain. The kingdom's treasury was already strained by the costs of the continuing war with France. Heavy taxation was unpopular. The peasants' revolt of just a few months earlier had demonstrated how explosive popular resentment of taxation could become. And now the king was proposing to pay an enormous sum to marry a foreign princess who brought no money, no lands, no obvious military advantages, nothing but an abstract diplomatic alliance. Critics pointed out that there had been other marriage proposals that would have been far more advantageous financially. Richard had been offered the hand of Caterina Visconti, daughter of Bernabo Visconti, the powerful lord of Milan. Caterina would have brought an enormous dowry that could have significantly helped England's financial situation. But Richard's advisors, particularly Michael de la Pole, had argued against this match. Milan was involved in complex and sometimes hostile relationships with other Italian states. Marrying into the Visconti family might entangle England in Italian politics in undesirable ways. The diplomatic benefits of the Bohemian match, they argued, far outweighed the immediate financial advantages of the Milanese match. Another complication in the negotiations involved the payment schedule. The 20,000 florins would not be paid all at once, but rather in installments over several years. The details of these installments had to be negotiated carefully. There were also questions about what would happen if Anne died before all the payments were made. Would England still owe the full amount? What if she died without producing children? These were indelicate questions, but they had to be addressed in the marriage treaty, as both sides wanted to protect their interests. The negotiations were further complicated when, in 1380, the English ambassadors who had been sent to Prague to conduct the negotiations were captured and held for ransom while returning to England. It's unclear exactly who captured them or why. They may have been seized by bandits, or by agents of France who wanted to disrupt the English-Bohemian alliance, or by some local ruler who saw an opportunity to extract ransom money from wealthy travelers. Whatever the cause, the ambassadors were held for some time, and ransom had to be paid for their release. This delayed the negotiations significantly and added to the costs of the entire enterprise. Despite these obstacles and delays, the negotiations slowly moved forward. Both sides wanted the marriage to proceed, even if for different reasons. By 1381, the broad outlines of an agreement had been reached. The marriage treaty was formally signed in May of 1381, more than 3 years after the negotiations had begun. The treaty specified the financial arrangements, the date and location of the wedding, the arrangements for Anne's household and income after the marriage, and various other details that needed to be settled before the marriage could proceed. But even with the treaty signed, there was still the enormous practical challenge of actually bringing Anne from Prague to England. This was not a simple matter of a few days' travel. The distance from Prague to London was more than 1,000 kilometers as the crow flies. And of course, travel was not as the crow flies, but along winding roads, through mountain passes, across rivers that had to be forded or crossed by ferry, through territories controlled by various rulers who might or might not be friendly. The journey would take weeks or even months, depending on conditions. It would require careful planning, substantial financial resources, armed escorts for protection, diplomatic arrangements to ensure safe passage through various territories, and considerable courage on the part of Anne herself, who would be leaving her home forever to travel to a distant land where she knew no one and did not speak the language. Anne's party would need to include not only her personal attendants and servants, but also Bohemian nobles and knights to provide protection and to maintain appropriate dignity for an imperial princess. There would need to be ladies-in-waiting to attend to Anne's personal needs, chaplains to ensure that religious observances were properly maintained, and various other officials and servants. This meant a travelling party of perhaps several dozen, or even more than 100 people, all of whom would need to be fed, housed, protected, and paid. The route from Prague to England presented several options, each with its own advantages and dangers. One possibility was to travel overland through the German lands to the Low Countries, then cross the English Channel from Calais or another port. This was the most direct route, but it would take the party through territories controlled by various German princes and through the Low Countries, where French influence was strong. Another possibility was to travel through German lands to a North Sea port and sail directly to England, avoiding the Channel crossing near France, but facing potentially dangerous open sea conditions. Ultimately, it was decided that Anne would travel overland through the German territories to Brussels in the Duchy of Brabant, wait there until arrangements could be made for a safe Channel crossing, and then sail from Calais to Dover. Sir Simon Burley, representing King Richard, would travel to Prague to meet Anne and would serve as her escort and protector throughout the journey. Burley's presence would ensure that Anne was treated with appropriate respect and would provide a direct link to the English court. In Prague, preparations for Anne's departure began in earnest in the summer and autumn of 1381. This was a momentous occasion for Anne and for her family. Anne was 15 years old, and she was leaving her homeland forever. Medieval royal marriages almost always meant permanent separation from one's birth family. Travel was difficult and dangerous, and married women were expected to reside with their husbands, not to make visits back to their childhood homes. Anne would probably never see Prague again, never see her mother again, never see her siblings again. This was understood and accepted as part of royal life, but it must have been emotionally wrenching nonetheless. Anne's mother, Elizabeth of Pomerania, must have had complex feelings about her daughter's departure. On one hand, this was a prestigious match that would make Anne a queen and would bring honour to the family. On the other hand, Elizabeth was losing her eldest daughter, sending her to a distant land where she might face difficulties, dangers, or unhappiness. The two women probably spent long hours together in those final weeks before Anne's departure, with Elizabeth giving her daughter advice about how to conduct herself as a queen, how to manage a household, how to deal with courtiers and rivals, how to maintain her dignity and protect her interests in a foreign court. King Wenceslaus, Anne's brother, was responsible for organising and funding Anne's travelling party, and for providing her with an appropriate trousseau of clothing, jewels, and household goods. A queen needed to arrive at her new court in appropriate state, with rich garments, precious jewels, fine linens, books, religious objects, and all the material goods necessary to establish a royal household. The costs of all this were substantial, and Wenceslaus may have resented having to pay these costs when England was already paying him for the marriage, but appearances had to be maintained. Anne could not arrive in England looking like a pauper, even if she was bringing no dowry. Anne's Bohemian attendants had to be carefully selected. These would be the people who would travel with her to England and who would serve her in her new court, at least initially. They needed to be people who could be trusted, who had appropriate skills and experience, who spoke German or Latin, since Anne did not yet speak English, and who were willing to leave Bohemia and settle permanently in England. Some of these attendants were ladies of noble Bohemian families, who would serve as Anne's ladies-in-waiting and companions. Others were servants, chaplains, and officials who would help manage Anne's household. The departure from Prague must have been an emotional scene. Anne would have said goodbye to her mother, her siblings, her childhood home, all the familiar places and people she had known her entire life. There would have been elaborate ceremonies, religious services to pray for Anne's safe journey and happy future, formal farewells from nobles and officials, and then Anne, surrounded by her travelling party, would have ridden out through the gates of Prague Castle, down the hill, across Charles Bridge, through the streets of Prague where people gathered to catch a glimpse of the Emperor's sister, leaving for her new life, and out onto the road that led westward toward Germany, toward the Low Countries, toward the sea, toward England, toward a husband she had never met, and a future she could not predict. The journey itself was long, slow, and not without dangers. Medieval travel, especially for such a large party, was limited by the speed of horses, the condition of roads, the availability of food and lodging, and the need for rest. On a good day, a mounted party might cover 30 or 40 kilometers, but there would be many days when progress was slower. Bad weather, poor roads, difficult river crossings, delays in arranging accommodations, or simply the need to rest both people and horses. The party would have travelled for weeks, stopping each night at castles, monasteries, or towns where accommodations had been arranged in advance. As they travelled westward through the German lands, Anne and her party would have experienced the diversity of the Holy Roman Empire. They would have passed through territories controlled by various princes, bishops, and free cities, each with its own laws, customs, and character. In some places, they would have been received with great ceremony and hospitality, as local rulers honoured the emperor's sister and sought to demonstrate their loyalty and their importance. In other places, the reception might have been more perfunctory, as local authorities provided the minimum necessary assistance and were glad to see the expensive and potentially troublesome travelling party move on to the next territory. The party would have experienced the rhythms of medieval travel. Early morning departures, long hours in the saddle or in travelling carriages, brief stops for rest and refreshment, searches for suitable stopping places as evening approached, nights spent in varying degrees of comfort depending on what accommodations were available, religious services each morning and evening to mark the passage of time and to invoke divine protection on the journey. For Anne, who had lived her entire life in the comfort and security of Prague Castle, this must have been simultaneously exciting and exhausting, an adventure and an ordeal. By late autumn of 1381, Anne's party had reached Brussels in the Duchy of Brabant. Brussels was a thriving city, capital of the duchy, and an important centre of trade and politics in the Low Countries. Here, Anne and her party would wait, while arrangements were made for the final and most dangerous leg of the journey, the crossing of the English Channel to England. But this crossing was not as simple as it might sound. The English Channel, the narrow body of water separating England from continental Europe, was one of the most important and most contested waterways in medieval Europe. It was the highway by which English armies crossed to France to wage the 100 Years' War. It was the route by which merchants carried valuable goods between England and the continent. It was also a zone of piracy, naval warfare, and political intrigue. In the autumn of 1381, the situation in the Channel was particularly dangerous for Anne. France, England's enemy, had every reason to want to disrupt the English-Bohemian alliance. Capturing Anne would be a tremendous coup. It would prevent the marriage, humiliate England, eliminate an important ally for Pope Urban, and give France a valuable hostage who could be used for diplomatic leverage. French ships, or privateers operating with French approval, were known to be patrolling the Channel, looking for an opportunity to intercept Anne's party. There was also a personal element to French opposition to the marriage. King Charles V of France had, some years earlier, tried to arrange a marriage between Anne and his own son, the Dauphin, who would later become Charles VI. Charles V had approached Anne's mother, Elizabeth of Pomerania, with this proposal. Such a marriage would have been advantageous for France, creating an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire and potentially isolating England diplomatically. But Elizabeth had refused the proposal. The reasons for this refusal are not entirely clear. Perhaps Bohemian interests were better served by maintaining neutrality between France and England. Perhaps there were concerns about the Dauphin's suitability, or perhaps Elizabeth simply had other plans for her daughter. Whatever the reasons, Charles V had not forgotten or forgiven this rejection. Now, seeing Anne about to marry England's king rather than his own son, Charles was determined to prevent it if possible. He ordered French ships to patrol the Channel and to watch for Anne's party, with instructions to capture her if the opportunity arose. This was technically an act of war or piracy, but Charles seems to have believed that the strategic benefits justified the risk. For weeks, Anne and her party waited in Brussels, uncertain how to proceed. Winter was approaching, which would make channel crossings even more dangerous due to storms and rough seas. But waiting indefinitely was also not a viable option. Provisions had to be paid for, and there were political pressures to complete the marriage and formalize the alliance. Sir Simon Burley and the other advisors debated various options. Should they try to sail from a northern port, avoiding the Channel altogether, but facing long open sea voyages in autumn weather? Should they wait until spring, when conditions would be better, but which would delay the marriage by many months? Should they try to negotiate safe passage with the French, perhaps through some neutral intermediary? While they debated and worried, events in France took an unexpected turn. King Charles V, who had been in good health and was only in his early 40s, suddenly fell gravely ill in September of 1381. The nature of his illness is not entirely clear from the historical sources. It may have been a stroke, a heart attack, some kind of infection, or some other acute condition. Whatever it was, it became clear within days that the king was dying. On his deathbed, Charles V had a change of heart regarding Anne of Bohemia, perhaps moved by religious concerns as he faced his final judgment, perhaps persuaded by advisers who argued that allowing Anne safe passage would be an act of chivalry that would bring credit to France, perhaps simply realizing that continuing to threaten her would accomplish nothing, since he would soon be dead anyway. Charles gave orders that the French ship should be recalled and that Anne should be granted safe passage across the Channel. Charles V died on the 16th of September, 1381, and was succeeded by his 12-year-old son, who became Charles VI. The new King's Regency Council, faced with many pressing concerns about governing France during a royal minority, had no particular interest in continuing Charles V's vendetta against Anne of Bohemia's marriage. They confirmed the order for safe passage, and word was sent to Brussels that Anne could now cross to England without fear of French interference. But by this time, autumn was well advanced, and the sailing season was nearly over. The English Channel in winter is notoriously rough, with frequent storms, high winds, and dangerous seas. Prudent mariners avoided winter crossings unless absolutely necessary. Anne and her advisers faced a difficult choice: wait out the winter in Brussels, which would mean further delay and expense, or attempt the crossing despite the weather risks. They chose to attempt the crossing. Perhaps the political pressure to complete the marriage was too great to brook further delay. Perhaps supplies and money were running short. Perhaps Anne herself was eager to reach her destination after months of travel and waiting. Whatever the reasons, in early December of 1381, Anne's party travelled from Brussels to Calais, the English-controlled port on the French coast, where ships were waiting to carry them across the Channel to Dover. The crossing was delayed by storms. Ships could not sail in the worst weather, when visibility was poor and winds were too strong to be managed. Anne and her party had to wait in Calais, watching the grey winter skies and the white-capped waves, hoping for a break in the weather. Finally, on the 18th of December, 1381, the captains judged that conditions were acceptable, though not ideal, for the crossing. Anne boarded one of the ships, along with her ladies-in-waiting and some of her attendants. The other ships carried the rest of her party and her baggage and supplies. The crossing from Calais to Dover is only about 34 kilometers. In good conditions, a sailing ship could make this crossing in a few hours. But conditions on the 18th of December, 1381, were not good. The sea was rough, the winds were strong and changeable, and as the small fleet of ships carrying Anne's party made its way across the dark winter waters, it was battered by waves and blown off course. Contemporary chroniclers, particularly Thomas Walsingham, described the crossing in dramatic terms. Walsingham, who was generally hostile to Anne and to the Bohemian marriage, writes that Anne's ships were nearly destroyed by storms, that they were tossed about by giant waves, that the crossing was terrifying and dangerous. He presents this as an evil omen, a sign from heaven that this foreign princess would bring misfortune to England. While we should be skeptical of Walsingham's interpretation, he was writing with clear bias. His description of dangerous weather conditions is probably accurate. The ships did make it safely to Dover, though the crossing was rough enough that Anne and her attendants, most of whom had probably never been to sea before, were seasick and frightened. One detail that Walsingham records, and that other chroniclers confirm, is that at least one of Anne's ships was badly damaged during the crossing or shortly after Anne's landing. According to these accounts, one ship was smashed to pieces, either by running aground, or by being driven against rocks, or simply by being broken apart by wave action. This happened after Anne herself had safely disembarked. If it had happened to Anne's own ship, the entire history we are recounting would have been very different. But the destruction of a ship so soon after Anne's arrival was noted as a troubling sign by those who were looking for reasons to criticize the marriage. Despite the rough crossing and the destruction of at least one ship, Anne herself arrived safely at Dover on the 18th of December, 1381. She had left Prague probably in September or early October, meaning that she had been travelling for 2.5 to 3 months. She had crossed Central Europe, waited for weeks in Brussels, and finally crossed the storm-tossed Channel. She was exhausted, probably still recovering from seasickness, far from home, unable to speak the language of her new country, and about to meet strangers who would judge her, evaluate her, and form opinions about whether she was a suitable queen for England. The reception at Dover was formal and carefully orchestrated. Anne was met by representatives of the English crown and by local officials who welcomed her to England on behalf of King Richard. There would have been ceremony and speeches, though how much of this Anne understood is unclear, since she did not yet speak English and would have needed interpreters. From Dover, Anne travelled to Canterbury, one of the most important cities in England and the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest-ranking cleric in the English Church. At Canterbury, Anne was received by Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, one of King Richard's uncles and one of the most powerful men in England. Thomas was the youngest surviving son of the late King Edward III, and he was brother to John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Thomas had been granted the title Duke of Gloucester earlier that same year of 1381, and he was building his own power base among the English nobility. His presence at Canterbury to welcome Anne was both an honour, showing that the royal family took her arrival seriously, and also a test, as Thomas and other nobles were evaluating this foreign princess to see whether she would be an asset or a liability to England. Thomas of Woodstock arrived at Canterbury with a large and impressive retinue. Medieval ceremonies were all about display, about demonstrating power and wealth through the number of attendants, the quality of their clothing and equipment, the elaborateness of the ceremony. Thomas understood this, and he made sure that Anne's reception at Canterbury would be sufficiently magnificent to honour her imperial status, while also impressing upon her the power and wealth of the English nobility. There were knights in full armour, nobles in rich velvet and fur-trimmed robes, horses with elaborate saddles and bridles, banners and standards bearing the coats of arms of various noble families, trumpeters to announce arrivals, and all the pageantry that medieval people expected on important occasions. Canterbury itself was one of England's most important cities, though it was much smaller than London. Its significance came not from commerce or government, but from religion. Canterbury Cathedral was the mother church of the English nation, the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the highest ecclesiastical authority in England. The cathedral was also the site of one of medieval England's most important shrines, the tomb of St. Thomas Becket, the Archbishop who had been murdered in the cathedral in 1170 by knights who thought they were carrying out King Henry II's wishes. Becket had been canonized as a martyr just 3 years after his death, and his shrine had become one of the most popular pilgrimage destinations in all of Christendom. People from across England and beyond came to Canterbury to pray at Becket's shrine, to seek healing from the saint's intercession, and to leave offerings of gratitude for prayers answered. Anne would have visited the shrine during her time in Canterbury. As a pious young woman who owned copies of scripture in 3 languages and who took her Christian faith seriously, she would have been eager to pay her respects at this holy site. she would have entered the great Gothic cathedral, walked through the soaring nave with its pointed arches reaching toward heaven, approached the shrine with its golden reliquary and precious ornaments, knelt in prayer, and asked for St. Thomas's blessing and protection as she began her new life as Queen of England. The visit to Becket's shrine was not merely a private devotional act, but also a public one, demonstrating Anne's piety and her respect for English religious traditions. From Canterbury, Anne's journey continued toward London. The road from Canterbury to London was one of the most important and most travelled routes in England, as pilgrims, merchants, government officials, and travellers of all kinds made their way between the capital and the port of Dover. Anne and her party would have travelled slowly, stopping at towns and estates along the way, allowing local people to catch glimpses of their future queen, and allowing Anne herself to rest after the exhausting journey from Prague and the frightening Channel crossing. As the party approached London, the scale of the reception grew larger. At Blackheath, a large open area on the southern approaches to the city, Anne was met by the Lord Mayor of London and a delegation of city officials and prominent citizens who had come out to welcome her. This was an important moment because London was by far the largest and wealthiest city in England, and the support of London's merchants and citizens was crucial to the stability of any English king. The Lord Mayor and his colleagues wanted to see this foreign princess for themselves, to form their own opinions about her, and to participate in the ceremony that would mark her arrival. The reception at Blackheath was elaborate. There were speeches of welcome, though again we must wonder how much Anne understood, not yet speaking English. There were presentations of gifts, perhaps valuable cloth, or spices, or other luxury goods from London's merchants. There was pageantry and ceremony designed to impress the new queen with London's wealth and importance. And there were crowds. Thousands of Londoners had come out to Blackheath to see the Bohemian princess who would be their queen. For many of these ordinary people, this would be their only chance to see Anne with their own eyes, and they pressed forward, jostling for position, trying to catch a glimpse of the small foreign woman who had travelled so far to marry their young king. The journey continued from Blackheath into London itself. Medieval London was a walled city, much smaller than the modern metropolis, with a population of perhaps 40 to 50,000 people. Large by medieval standards, but tiny compared to modern cities. The city was crowded, noisy, smelly, and vibrant. Houses and shops were packed closely together along narrow streets. Church bells rang constantly, marking the hours and calling the faithful to prayer. Markets bustled with activity. The Thames River was full of boats and barges carrying goods and people. And everywhere there were people. Merchants, craftsmen, labourers, beggars, nobles, clergy, visitors from foreign lands, speaking a variety of languages and dialects, all pursuing their own business in the great commercial and political capital of England. As Anne's procession entered London and made its way through the streets toward Westminster, where she would meet King Richard and where the wedding would take place, the crowds grew even larger. The streets were lined with people who had come out to see the new queen. Some were genuinely curious or welcoming. Others were skeptical or hostile, having heard complaints about the costs of the marriage and wondering whether this foreign princess was worth the enormous sum that England was paying for her. The chroniclers record that the reception was mixed. Some people cheered and waved. Others stood in sullen silence or muttered complaints. At one point, a fountain had been specially decorated for Anne's arrival, with the arms of England and the arms of the Holy Roman Empire displayed together, symbolizing the union that was about to take place. But as Anne's procession passed by this fountain, some members of the crowd actually reached up and tore down the crossed arms, ripping them apart in a gesture that was clearly meant as an insult and a rejection of the marriage. This public display of hostility must have been shocking and frightening for Anne, who was already exhausted and overwhelmed by the journey and by the strangeness of her new surroundings. The Westminster chronicler, writing about Anne's arrival, described her dismissively as a tiny scrap of humanity. This phrase has been quoted by historians ever since, and it tells us something about the initial English reaction to Anne. She was small in stature. Contemporary descriptions suggest she was petite, with delicate features. By medieval standards of beauty, which tended to favour taller, more robust women, Anne may not have been considered particularly attractive. And she arrived with no dowry, at great expense to England, from a distant kingdom that most English people knew little about. It's not surprising that some chroniclers and some of the public were disappointed or critical. But there was one person whose opinion mattered more than all the chroniclers and all the sceptical crowds put together, and that was King Richard II himself. Anne was coming to England to marry Richard, and if Richard was pleased with her, if they formed a good relationship, then the opinions of chroniclers and crowds would matter much less. Everything depended on what happened when Anne and Richard finally met face to face for the first time. This meeting took place at Leeds Castle in Kent, where Richard had travelled to await Anne's arrival. Leeds Castle was not in the city of Leeds in northern England, but rather in Kent, in the southeastern part of the country, not far from Canterbury. It was a beautiful castle, set on islands in a lake, surrounded by water, with elegant architecture and comfortable royal apartments. It was a favourite residence of English queens. Richard's own mother, Joan of Kent, had loved Leeds Castle, and many queens before her had stayed there. Richard had spent the Christmas season of 1381 at Leeds Castle, waiting for Anne to complete her journey from Dover and Canterbury. Christmas was one of the great festivals of the medieval year, a time of feasting, gift-giving, religious celebration, and elaborate ceremony. For Richard to spend Christmas at Leeds, rather than at one of the major royal palaces like Westminster or Windsor, was unusual, but it reflected his eagerness to meet his bride and to begin their life together as soon as possible. We can imagine Richard's state of mind as he waited at Leeds for Anne's arrival. He was 14 years old, still very young, though by medieval standards he was approaching manhood. He had been king for 4.5 years, since his grandfather's death in 1377. He had experienced the terrifying crisis of the peasants' revolt just 6 months earlier, when armed rebels had invaded London, executed his officials, and threatened his life. He had ridden out to meet those rebels at age 14 and had managed, through a combination of courage, promises, and good fortune, to defuse the crisis and survive. He had proven himself capable of bravery in a crisis, but he was still learning to be a king, still surrounded by ambitious uncles and advisors who often had their own agendas. And now he was about to meet the young woman who would become his wife. This marriage had been arranged by his advisors for political reasons. Richard himself probably had little say in the choice of bride. That decision was made by Michael de la Pole, by his council, by political and diplomatic considerations that had little to do with Richard's personal preferences. But now that the marriage was arranged and the bride was arriving, Richard must have wondered, what would she be like? Would they get along? Would she be kind or cold, intelligent or dull, beautiful or plain? Would she speak any language he could understand? Or would they need interpreters even for private conversations? Would she be a companion and a comfort, or merely another stranger in a court full of strangers? The sources suggest that when Anne and Richard finally met at Leeds Castle, probably on Christmas Day, or shortly thereafter in late December of 1381, something remarkable happened. Despite the political nature of their union, despite the criticism that had greeted Anne's arrival, despite their youth and inexperience, despite the fact that they could not easily communicate in a common language, Anne and Richard seemed to have formed an immediate and genuine affection for one another. One contemporary chronicler described them as two wispy teenagers. Both were small in stature. Both were young. Both were somewhat delicate in appearance. Richard was about 15 years old. Anne was 15 and a half. Both had grown up in royal courts. Both understood the pressures and expectations of royal life. Both had experienced the loneliness that came with being royal children, surrounded by ambitious adults pursuing their own agendas. Perhaps they recognized something in each other, a kindred spirit, someone who would understand their unique position, someone who could be a true companion rather than just another courtier or advisor seeking favor or advantage. The sources that describe their first meeting are not detailed enough to tell us exactly what happened or what they said to each other. Medieval chroniclers were generally not interested in recording private conversations or emotional moments, especially between a king and queen. But later events would make it clear that Richard and Anne's relationship was not merely a political arrangement, but a genuine love match. Richard would prove to be devoted to Anne throughout their 12 years of marriage, and his grief at her death would be so extreme that it would shock contemporaries and contribute to his eventual downfall. For now, in late December of 1381, at Leeds Castle, Richard and Anne simply met, talked through interpreters, and began to get to know each other. Anne was learning her first words of English, simple greetings, basic phrases, the names of the people around her. Richard was learning a bit about Bohemia, about Prague, about Anne's family and her journey to England. They were discovering each other's personalities, finding common ground, beginning to build a relationship that would sustain them through the challenges ahead. After spending some time at Leeds Castle, Anne and Richard travelled together to Westminster, where the wedding ceremony would take place. Westminster was the political and ceremonial heart of England, the site of the royal palace and Westminster Abbey, the great Gothic church where English kings were crowned and where many of them were eventually buried. The abbey had been founded in the 11th century by Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king before the Norman conquest, and it had been rebuilt in the 13th century in the magnificent Gothic style with soaring pointed arches, elaborate stone tracery, flying buttresses, and vast expanses of stained glass. The wedding was scheduled for the 20th of January, 1382, about 3 weeks after Anne had arrived in England. This gave time for final preparations, for Anne to rest after her journey, for the wedding ceremony to be planned and rehearsed, and for nobles and officials from across England to travel to Westminster to attend. A royal wedding was not merely a private family affair, but a great state occasion, an opportunity to display royal magnificence, to reinforce social hierarchies, to celebrate a dynastic alliance, and to provide entertainment and spectacle for the nobility and common people alike. The wedding ceremony itself took place in Westminster Abbey on the 20th of January, 1382. This was the 5th royal wedding to be held at Westminster Abbey in English history, and remarkably, it would be the last one for more than 500 years. The next royal wedding at Westminster Abbey would not occur until the 20th century, when Prince Albert, the future King George VI, married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon there in 1923. Medieval wedding ceremonies were quite different from modern ones, though there were also many similarities. The ceremony would have been conducted in Latin, the universal language of the Catholic Church, by a bishop or archbishop, probably by William Courtenay, who was Bishop of London at the time and who would later become Archbishop of Canterbury. The ceremony included many elements that would be familiar to anyone who has attended a Christian wedding. Vows exchanged between the bride and groom, blessings pronounced by the clergy, prayers for the couple's happiness and fertility, readings from Scripture. But there were also elements that might seem strange or uncomfortable to modern sensibilities. Medieval marriage theology emphasized the wife's submission to her husband. The wedding vows that Anne would have spoken included a promise to obey Richard as her lord and husband. Medieval people believed that this hierarchical relationship between husband and wife was ordained by God, that it reflected the relationship between Christ and the Church, and that it was necessary for the proper ordering of society. A wife was expected to defer to her husband's judgment, to manage his household, to provide him with children, and to be faithful, obedient, and supportive. At the same time, medieval marriage theology also emphasized the husband's responsibility to love, protect, and provide for his wife. A husband was not supposed to be a tyrant, but rather a benevolent protector. He was supposed to consult his wife on important matters, to value her opinions, and to treat her with respect and affection. The ideal medieval marriage was one in which the husband and wife worked together as partners, each fulfilling their proper role, with mutual love and respect despite the hierarchical structure of the relationship. For Anne and Richard, the wedding ceremony was their public commitment to each other and to the roles they would play for the rest of their lives. Anne was promising to be Richard's queen, his wife, his companion, the mother of his future children. Richard was promising to be Anne's husband, her protector, her lord. They were both promising to uphold the alliance between England and Bohemia, to represent their respective kingdoms and families, to fulfill the expectations that came with their royal positions. The ceremony would have been long and elaborate, probably lasting several hours. There would have been processions, chants, prayers, readings, exchanges of vows and rings, the nuptial mass with its communion service, more prayers and blessings. The abbey would have been crowded with nobles, clergy, officials, and other important people who had been invited to witness the ceremony. Everyone would have been dressed in their finest clothing, rich velvets and silks, fur trim, jewels, gold chains, elaborate headdresses. The altar would have been decorated with precious hangings, gold and silver vessels, candles, flowers or greenery. The air would have been thick with incense, its sweet-smelling smoke rising toward the vaulted ceiling high above. For Anne, who had attended countless religious services in Prague Castle and in the great cathedral there, the liturgy and ceremony would have been familiar, even if the specific customs and the English setting were new. She would have understood the Latin of the service, would have known when to kneel and when to stand, would have followed the familiar rhythms of the Mass, but she must also have been overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. She was being married to a king, in a foreign land, surrounded by strangers, with her entire future depending on how this relationship developed. She was 15 years old. After the wedding ceremony came the coronation. Anne was crowned Queen of England 2 days later, on the 22nd of January, 1382. The coronation was a separate ceremony from the wedding because Anne was being crowned not merely as Richard's wife, but as Queen of England in her own right, with her own status, her own authority, and her own responsibilities. A queen consort in medieval England was not merely the king's wife. She was also a political figure with her own household, her own income, her own ceremonial duties, and her own role in governance, particularly in the area of dispensing mercy and acting as intercessor. The coronation ceremony was even more elaborate than the wedding had been. It was modelled on the ceremony used to crown kings, with many of the same elements. Anne would have been led into Westminster Abbey in solemn procession, probably walking under a canopy carried by knights or nobles, accompanied by bishops and nobles in full ceremonial dress. She would have been dressed in royal robes, probably in a gown of rich fabric with ermine or other precious fur trim, colours that signified royalty. At the high altar, Anne would have taken an oath, promising to uphold the laws and customs of England, to protect the Church, to dispense justice, and to rule wisely. Then came the most sacred part of the ceremony, the anointing with holy oil. The Archbishop would have touched Anne's forehead, hands, and perhaps breast with oil that had been specially blessed for this purpose. This anointing was understood to transform Anne, giving her a sacred character, making her not merely a noble woman, but an anointed queen, chosen and blessed by God to rule. The oil used in English coronations was believed to have miraculous properties. Legend said it had been given to Thomas Becket by the Virgin Mary herself. After the anointing came the investiture with the symbols of queenship. Anne would have been given a scepter to hold, symbolizing her authority. She would have been given a ring, symbolizing her marriage to the kingdom. And most importantly, she would have been crowned. A precious crown of gold, probably decorated with jewels and pearls, would have been placed on her head by the Archbishop. At this moment, as the crown touched her head, Anne officially became Queen of England. The assembled nobles and clergy would have shouted, "Vivat Regina!" "Long live the Queen!" and bells would have rung throughout London to announce that England had a new queen. A beautiful illuminated manuscript called the Liber Regalis, which contained the order of service for English coronations, is said to have been created specifically for Anne's coronation, or to have been used at her coronation. This precious manuscript, beautifully decorated with illustrations of coronation scenes, showed 3 different configurations: a king being crowned alone, a queen being crowned alone, and a king and queen being crowned together. The manuscript survives to this day and can be seen in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee galleries at Westminster Abbey, a testament to the importance of Anne's coronation and to the artistic and ceremonial culture of Richard's court. After the coronation came a full week of celebrations. Medieval royal weddings and coronations were not single-day events, but rather extended festivals that might last for days or even weeks. There would have been elaborate feasts in the great halls of Westminster Palace, with hundreds of guests seated according to careful hierarchies of rank and precedence. The feasts would have featured multiple courses of elaborate dishes, roasted meats, game birds, fish prepared in various ways, pies and pastries, fruits and sweetmeats, all washed down with wine and ale. Medieval feast dishes were often as much about display as about eating. There might be sculptures made of sugar or marzipan, or dishes arranged to look like castles or animals, or peacocks roasted and then redressed in their own feathers to create a spectacular visual effect. Between the feasting, there would have been entertainment. Medieval courts employed musicians, jugglers, acrobats, and other performers to provide amusement at important occasions. There might have been singers performing courtly love songs, instrumentalists playing viols, harps, or other medieval instruments, jesters telling jokes and performing comic routines. There would certainly have been dancing, elaborate court dances with complex steps and patterns, opportunities for nobles to display their grace and elegance. Outside the palace, there would have been tournaments, the great spectator sport of medieval aristocracy. Knights in full armour would joust, charging at each other with lances, trying to unhorse their opponents. There would have been other martial contests, sword fighting, archery competitions, contests of strength and skill. Tournaments were both entertainment and serious business. They allowed knights to practice their military skills, to win honour and glory, to display their prowess, and sometimes to win valuable prizes. They were also dangerous. Knights were sometimes injured or even killed in tournament competitions, despite the elaborate rules and safety precautions that had developed over centuries of tournament culture. For Anne, these weeks of celebration must have been both exhilarating and exhausting. She was the center of attention, the new queen whom everyone wanted to see and evaluate. She was learning English as quickly as she could, though she was still dependent on interpreters for complex conversations. She was trying to learn English customs and manners, trying to understand the complex web of relationships and rivalries among the English nobility, trying to establish her own household and her own position at court. She was also presumably beginning her intimate relationship with Richard, though medieval sources are discreetly silent about such matters. After the week of celebrations at Westminster, Richard and Anne travelled together by river to Windsor Castle. Travel by boat on the Thames was common and practical for medieval royalty, as river transport was often faster and more comfortable than travelling overland on bumpy roads. Windsor Castle, located about 20 miles upstream from London, had been a royal residence since the time of William the Conqueror, and had been extensively rebuilt and expanded by Richard's grandfather, Edward III. It was one of the largest and most impressive castles in England, with massive walls, tall towers, elaborate apartments for the royal family, and beautiful chapels. Windsor would become one of Richard and Anne's favourite residences. It offered more privacy than Westminster, where the court was always bustling with officials, petitioners, and visitors. At Windsor, Richard and Anne could have some degree of personal space, some time to themselves away from the constant scrutiny of the court. They could walk in the castle's gardens, hunt in the nearby forests, attend services in the castle's chapel, and simply spend time together getting to know each other as their relationship developed from a political arrangement into something more personal. Richard's mother, Joan of Kent, travelled with them to Windsor and stayed with them for a time. Joan had been a powerful influence on Richard's life since his father's death. She was protective of her son, worried about the political intrigues that swirled around him, and eager to ensure that his marriage to Anne would be successful. Joan seems to have taken Anne under her wing to some extent, helping the young Bohemian princess adjust to English life, teaching her about English customs and expectations, and generally trying to make Anne feel welcome and supported. For Anne, who had left her own mother behind in Prague, and who must have felt very alone in her new country, Joan's maternal attention may have been a great comfort. The early months of 1382, as winter turned to spring, were a period of adjustment for Anne. She was learning English, though it would take time before she was fully fluent. She was establishing her household, which included both English attendants assigned to serve the new queen and Bohemian attendants, who had travelled with her from Prague. She was learning to navigate the complex politics of the English court, where various nobles and factions competed for influence over the young king. She was getting to know Richard, his personality, his moods, his interests, his strengths and weaknesses. Richard, for his part, seems to have been genuinely pleased with his bride. Despite the initial skepticism and criticism that had greeted Anne's arrival, despite the fact that the marriage had been arranged for political reasons without much regard for personal compatibility, Richard and Anne were developing a real affection for each other. Richard was known to be interested in art, literature, fashion, and ceremony. He was more aesthetically inclined than most medieval kings, who were expected to be primarily warriors and military leaders. Anne, with her background in the culturally sophisticated court of Prague, where her father Charles IV had patronized artists and scholars, shared many of Richard's cultural interests. They could discuss books, art, and music. They could appreciate the beautiful objects and elaborate ceremonies that were part of royal life. More fundamentally, they seem to have simply liked each other as people. This was not something that could be taken for granted in medieval royal marriages, which were arranged for political reasons with little or no consideration of personal compatibility. Many royal couples maintained formal, distant relationships, doing their duty by producing heirs, but otherwise living largely separate lives. Some royal marriages were actively unhappy, with spouses who disliked or even hated each other forced to maintain the appearance of unity for political reasons. But Richard and Anne seem to have been fortunate, or perhaps they worked to make their marriage successful, in developing a genuinely warm and affectionate relationship. One piece of evidence for their affection comes from a letter that Richard wrote to Anne's mother, Elizabeth of Pomerania, at some point after the marriage. In this letter, Richard refers to Elizabeth as Mater Nostra Carissima, our most dear mother. The use of the word carissima, the superlative form of dear or beloved, suggests genuine warmth and affection. Richard is essentially telling his mother-in-law that he loves her daughter, that Anne is his beloved, and that he therefore regards Elizabeth with affection as the mother of his beloved. This was not merely diplomatic politeness, but a sincere expression of feeling. Contemporary observers also noted the growing affection between Richard and Anne. Chroniclers who had initially been skeptical or critical of the marriage began to acknowledge that the young king seemed genuinely devoted to his Bohemian bride. Richard and Anne were frequently seen together, travelling together, attending services together, appearing together at court ceremonies and public events. This was somewhat unusual. Many medieval kings and queens lived largely separate lives, each with their own household and schedule, coming together mainly for formal occasions or for the purpose of producing heirs. But Richard seems to have actively wanted Anne's company, and Anne seems to have reciprocated. As the months of 1382 passed, and Anne settled into her new life as Queen of England, she began to discover what her role would truly mean. Beyond the ceremonial duties, beyond the elaborate court rituals, beyond the management of her household, there was one role that medieval queens were especially expected to fulfill: the role of intercessor, the merciful voice pleading for compassion when the king's justice seemed harsh. This role of intercession was not merely symbolic, but deeply embedded in medieval political culture. A king needed to be strong, to enforce laws, to punish wrongdoers, to demonstrate that royal authority could not be challenged. But absolute harshness could breed resentment and rebellion. The queen, as intercessor, provided a safety valve, a way for mercy to be shown without the king appearing weak. When a queen pleaded for a condemned prisoner, kneeling before her husband with tears in her eyes, begging him to show mercy, the king could grant the pardon and appear magnanimous rather than weak. The prisoner was saved, the king's image was enhanced, and social harmony was preserved. Anne embraced this role of intercessor with remarkable dedication. Within months of her marriage, she began actively petitioning Richard for pardons and acts of mercy. Her first major intervention came in the aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which had occurred just months before Anne's arrival in England. Although the revolt had been suppressed and the main leaders executed, hundreds of ordinary people who had participated were still facing punishment. Some were imprisoned, awaiting trial. Others had been tried and condemned to death, but not yet executed. Still others were fugitives, hiding in fear of arrest. The government's policy was harsh: make examples of enough people to ensure that no one would dare rebel again. But Anne saw in these condemned and fearful people not rebels, but desperate souls who deserved a second chance. Anne began to plead with Richard for pardons. She would kneel before him. This gesture of humility was important, showing that even a queen must humble herself to ask for mercy, and she would describe the circumstances of particular individuals. This man had been swept up in the excitement of the moment, but had not committed violence. That man had a wife and children who would starve if he were hanged. This other man was young and foolish, but capable of reform. Anne's intercessions were often successful. Richard, who seems to have genuinely loved his young wife and wanted to please her, granted many of these pardons. The common people noticed. Here was a foreign princess who had arrived to criticism and skepticism, who was now actively working to save English lives. Here was a queen who cared about ordinary people, who would use her influence with the king to show mercy. Gradually, public opinion about Anne began to shift. The dismissive phrase, "tiny scrap of humanity," gave way to a new title that would stick throughout her life and beyond: Good Queen Anne. In 1384, just 2 years after her marriage, Anne saved the life of John Northampton, a former mayor of London who had become entangled in the bitter factional politics of the city. London's governance was dominated by wealthy merchant guilds, and there were constant conflicts between different factions competing for power and influence. Northampton had been on the losing side of one of these conflicts and had been condemned to death for his role in various disturbances and alleged conspiracies. Anne's intercession for Northampton was particularly dramatic. She appeared before Richard in public, at a formal court session where nobles and officials were gathered. She fell to her knees before the king, not in private, but in front of this assembled audience, and she pleaded eloquently for Northampton's life. She described his service to the city, argued that death was too harsh a punishment for his offences, and begged Richard to show mercy. The scene was carefully choreographed political theatre. Anne's public humility, her tears, her passionate advocacy all demonstrated her compassion, while also allowing Richard to demonstrate his own mercy and wisdom by granting her request. But beneath the theatre was genuine emotion. Anne truly believed in mercy, truly wanted to save lives, and Richard truly loved his wife and wanted to honour her requests when possible. Northampton's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. His life was saved through Anne's intervention. The chroniclers of the time took note of Anne's tireless efforts on behalf of the condemned. Thomas Walsingham, who had initially been hostile to Anne's arrival, later wrote a moving eulogy after her death, in which he praised her dedication to God, for her almsgiving, her support for the poor and the church. Another chronicler noted that Anne was well known for her tireless attempts to intercede on behalf of the people, procuring pardons for participants in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and numerous other pardons for wrongdoers. In 1389, 7 years after her marriage, Anne interceded for a man who had been indicted for a murder committed 14 years earlier. The details of the case are lost to history, but the fact that Anne was still actively seeking pardons years after her arrival, that she was tracking down old cases and arguing for mercy even for serious crimes like murder, demonstrates the depth of her commitment to this role. She was not simply performing ceremonial intercessions in high-profile cases, but actively working year after year to identify people who deserved mercy and to persuade Richard to grant it. Anne's reputation for mercy spread throughout England. People began to see her as someone who genuinely cared about the well-being of ordinary subjects, who would use her power and influence to help, rather than to enrich herself or advance her own interests. In a medieval world, where the powerful often exploited the powerless, where justice could be harsh and arbitrary, where the gap between nobles and commoners was vast, Anne's kindness and compassion stood out. She became genuinely beloved by the English people, earning a reputation that would last for centuries. But Anne's intercessions were not always successful. In 1388, 6 years after her marriage, Anne experienced one of the greatest failures and disappointments of her life when she was unable to save Sir Simon Burley, the man who had escorted her from Bohemia to England and who had been a loyal friend to both Richard and Anne. The crisis began with what became known as the Merciless Parliament of 1388, as Richard grew older and began to assert his authority more strongly. Tensions developed between the young king and certain powerful nobles, who resented his independence and his choice of advisers. Richard had surrounded himself with a circle of favourites, men like Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, and Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, who had the king's trust and friendship, but who were resented by other nobles who felt excluded from power. 5 powerful nobles, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, Richard's uncle, Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby, who would later become King Henry IV, and Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham, formed a coalition against Richard's favourites. They called themselves the Lords Appellant and claimed they were acting to save the kingdom from evil counsellors who were misadvising the king and enriching themselves at the realm's expense. In late 1387, the Lords Appellant confronted Richard with an ultimatum: dismiss your favourites or face the consequences. When Richard refused, the Lords Appellant raised an army. Richard's forces were defeated at the Battle of Radcot Bridge in December 1387, and Richard was forced to submit to the Lords Appellant's demands. Several of Richard's closest friends fled into exile or were captured. In February 1388, the Lords Appellant convened a parliament, the Merciless Parliament, where they put Richard's favourites and advisers on trial for treason. This was a show trial with a predetermined outcome. The Lords Appellant were determined to make examples of Richard's friends to demonstrate their power and to humiliate the king. One after another, Richard's advisers were condemned to death. Some, like Robert de Vere, had escaped into exile and were condemned in absentia, but others were present and faced immediate execution. Among those condemned was Sir Simon Burley. Burley's crimes were essentially political. He had been too close to Richard, had received too many royal grants and favours, had been involved in controversial decisions, but these were not capital offences under normal circumstances. The Lords Appellant wanted Burley dead, not because of specific crimes, but because he represented Richard's independence, his right to choose his own advisers and friends. Executing Burley would send a message. The king must defer to the great nobles, must not elevate men outside the traditional power structure, must accept that his power was limited. Richard and Anne both desperately wanted to save Burley. Burley had been Richard's tutor, had served Richard's father, the Black Prince, had escorted Anne from Bohemia to England, had been a loyal friend and servant for decades. Richard pleaded with the Lords Appellant to spare Burley's life. He offered to ransom Burley, to exile him, to strip him of all offices and lands, anything but execution. Anne also intervened. She went to the Lords Appellant and begged them to show mercy. According to contemporary accounts, she fell to her knees before these powerful nobles and pleaded for Burley's life with tears streaming down her face. She spoke of Burley's long service, his loyalty, his kindness to her during her journey to England. She invoked her position as queen, her role as intercessor, the mercy that should temper justice. But this time, Anne's pleas fell on deaf ears. The Lords Appellant were unmoved. They saw Richard and Anne's desperation as evidence of their power, proof that they had humiliated the king and queen and could do as they pleased. On the 5th of May, 1388, Sir Simon Burley was beheaded on Tower Hill. Richard and Anne were forced to watch their friend executed while being unable to save him. The execution of Burghley was a devastating blow to both Richard and Anne. For Richard, it was a profound humiliation, a demonstration that he could not protect even his closest friends when the great nobles united against him. For Anne, it was a failure of her role as intercessor, a painful lesson that mercy had limits, that there were situations where even a queen's pleas would be ignored. The failure to save Burghley seems to have deepened the bond between Richard and Anne, as they shared grief and frustration at their powerlessness in the face of noble opposition. Richard never forgave the Lord's appellant for Burghley's death. Years later, in 1397, when Richard had finally accumulated enough power to take revenge, he would arrest or exile most of the Lord's appellant and would execute Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, the same man who would later arrive late to Anne's funeral and be struck by the grieving king. But despite this painful failure, Anne continued her work as intercessor. She understood that not every plea would be successful, but that did not mean she should stop trying. Throughout the late 1380s and early 1390s, Anne continued to seek pardons, to plead for the condemned, to use her influence to show mercy whenever possible. One of Anne's most famous and most significant acts of intercession came in 1392 during what became known as the reconciliation of Richard with the City of London. This event demonstrated not only Anne's skill as a mediator, but also her importance in the political life of England. The crisis began when Richard requested a large loan from the City of London to help finance his governmental and military expenses. London, suffering from economic difficulties, plague outbreaks, and the general strain of heavy taxation, refused the loan. Richard, who had a fierce temper and a strong sense of his royal prerogatives, was furious at this refusal. He saw it as an insult to his authority, a challenge to his kingship. Richard's response was harsh and vengeful. He arrested the Lord Mayor and Sheriffs of London, accusing them of mismanagement and disloyalty. He revoked many of London's traditional privileges and rights of self-government, placing the city under direct royal control. He moved the royal courts and government offices out of London to other cities, depriving London of the economic benefits of hosting the royal government. And most significantly, he imposed an enormous fine on the city, £100,000, a staggering sum that would take years to pay, and that would cripple London's economy. The situation was extremely tense. London was by far the largest and wealthiest city in England, and alienating it completely could have serious consequences for royal authority and for the kingdom's economy. But Richard's anger was such that he seemed determined to punish London severely, regardless of the consequences. The Lord Mayor and Aldermen of London appealed to various nobles and officials, hoping someone could persuade Richard to moderate his demands. But Richard refused all appeals. This is where Anne stepped in as mediator. She approached Richard privately and began to work on him, using her influence as his beloved wife to soften his anger. She argued that mercy would serve Richard's interests better than continued harshness, that reconciliation with London would strengthen rather than weaken his authority, that a king who showed magnanimous forgiveness would be more respected than one who pursued vendetta. Over days and weeks, Anne gradually worked on Richard, appealing to his better nature, helping him to see a way out of the crisis that would allow him to appear merciful rather than weak. Anne also worked with London's representatives, helping them to understand what they needed to do to placate Richard, what gestures of submission and apology would be acceptable. She essentially served as a back-channel negotiator, shuttling between Richard and London, working to craft a settlement that both sides could accept. The result was an elaborate public ceremony of reconciliation. carefully choreographed political theatre that would allow Richard to show mercy, London to submit gracefully, and Anne to be celebrated as the peacemaker. The ceremony took place in several stages. First, at Windsor Castle, Anne formally approached Richard in the presence of his council and various nobles. She knelt before him and begged him to show mercy to London, to forgive the city's offences, to restore its privileges. This was done publicly, so that everyone could witness Anne's humility and Richard's magnanimity. Then the royal couple travelled to Nottingham, where they received a delegation from London. Again, Anne publicly interceded, kneeling before Richard and pleading for the city. Richard, following the script they had worked out privately, expressed his willingness to consider mercy. Finally, Richard and Anne made a formal entry into London itself. This was a major ceremonial occasion, with elaborate pageantry and symbolism. The streets were decorated, crowds gathered to witness the event, and the city's leaders assembled to welcome their king and queen. The procession made its way to Westminster Hall, the great ceremonial hall of the royal palace. In Westminster Hall, before a large audience of nobles, clergy, city officials, and common people, Anne performed the climactic act of the ceremony. She knelt before Richard, not in private, but in full public view, and formally begged him to forgive London and restore the city's rights. Richard, playing his part perfectly, raised Anne from her knees, seated her beside him on the throne, and announced that he would pardon the city and restore its privileges in honour of his beloved Queen's intercession. The ceremony was a triumph for everyone involved. London received back its rights and had most of its fine forgiven. Richard appeared as a magnanimous monarch who listened to wise counsel and showed mercy. And Anne was celebrated as the peacemaker, the gentle queen whose compassion had saved the great city. The poet Richard Maidstone wrote a detailed poem about the event called Reconciliation of Richard II with the City of London, which celebrated Anne's role and helped to spread her reputation throughout England. This event in 1392, 2 years before Anne's death, represented the pinnacle of her success as intercessor and mediator. She had not merely saved individual lives, but had resolved a major political crisis, had helped to reconcile the king with his greatest city, had demonstrated the real power that a queen could wield through compassion and diplomacy, rather than through force. While Anne was earning her reputation as Good Queen Anne, through her intercessions and mercy, she was also playing a quieter but perhaps more historically significant role in protecting religious reformers and encouraging the spread of religious learning. This aspect of Anne's legacy would have consequences that extended far beyond her lifetime, influencing the Protestant Reformation more than a century after her death. The key figure in this story was John Wycliffe, the Oxford theologian, an early religious reformer. Wycliffe was born around 1330 and had spent most of his adult life at Oxford University, becoming one of the most learned and influential scholars of his generation. But in the 1370s and early 1380s, Wycliffe had begun to advocate positions that brought him into conflict with the Catholic Church hierarchy. Wycliffe argued that the Bible, rather than church tradition or papal pronouncements, should be the ultimate authority for Christian belief and practice. He criticized the wealth and political power of the Church, arguing that clergy should live in apostolic poverty rather than accumulating lands and riches. He questioned the doctrine of transubstantiation, the teaching that the bread and wine of the Eucharist literally became the body and blood of Christ. He argued that Christians should be able to read Scripture in their own languages rather than only in Latin. These ideas were radical and dangerous. Wycliffe had powerful protectors, including John of Gaunt and Joan of Kent, Richard's mother. But he also had powerful enemies among bishops and church officials who saw his teachings as heretical and who wanted him silenced, imprisoned, or executed. The political protection of nobles like John of Gaunt kept Wycliffe safe for many years, but that protection was uncertain and could be withdrawn at any time. Anne of Bohemia became one of Wycliffe's protectors. This may seem surprising. Why would a pious Catholic queen protect a man whose teachings challenged Catholic doctrine? But we must understand Anne's background. She came from Bohemia, where there was a tradition of religious reform going back to earlier movements. She owned copies of scripture in 3 languages and believed in the importance of ordinary Christians being able to read God's word. She had been taught that personal piety and devotion to scripture were essential to Christian life. Wycliffe's emphasis on scripture and his desire to make the Bible accessible to ordinary people resonated with Anne's own beliefs and practices. Anne used her influence to protect Wycliffe from persecution. When church officials wanted to prosecute him for heresy, Anne intervened with Richard and with powerful nobles, arguing that Wycliffe should be allowed to continue his scholarly work. When there were attempts to silence Wycliffe or to prevent him from teaching, Anne's protection made such efforts more difficult. She may not have agreed with all of Wycliffe's theological positions, but she believed in protecting scholars and in allowing debate about religious questions. More significantly, Anne actively encouraged students from Bohemia to come to Oxford to study under Wycliffe and to learn his ideas. During Anne's years as queen, there was a significant flow of Bohemian students to Oxford, many of whom studied Wycliffe's works, attended his lectures, and copied his manuscripts. When these students returned to Bohemia, they brought Wycliffe's writings with them. One of these Bohemian students was Jerome of Prague, who studied at Oxford in the late 1390s and early 1400s, and who made careful copies of many of Wycliffe's works. Jerome took these copies back to Prague, where they were studied by another scholar named Jan Hus. Hus, influenced deeply by Wycliffe's writings, began to preach and teach similar ideas about church reform, biblical authority, and the need for clergy to live in poverty and holiness rather than wealth and power. Hus's movement grew powerful in Bohemia, attracting thousands of followers. The Hussite movement, as it came to be called, challenged Catholic authority in Bohemia and led to decades of religious conflict. Hus himself was burned at the stake as a heretic in 1415, condemned by the Council of Constance, but his followers continued, and the Hussite movement became one of the major precursors to the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, acknowledged his debt to both Wycliffe and Hus. Luther's famous statement, "We are all Hussites," reflected his understanding that the Protestant Reformation built on foundations laid by earlier reformers, and those earlier reformers, Hus and Wycliffe, were connected through the Bohemian students who came to Oxford during Anne of Bohemia's time as Queen of England. Anne's role in this chain of influence was not dramatic or highly visible during her lifetime. She was not writing theological treatises or leading reform movements, but by protecting Wycliffe, by encouraging Bohemian students to study at Oxford, by fostering intellectual and religious exchange between England and Bohemia, Anne helped to spread ideas that would eventually transform Christianity. Archbishop Arundel, speaking at Anne's funeral, specifically mentioned that, although she was a stranger, not native to England, yet she constantly studied the 4 Gospels in English and explained by the exposition of the doctors. This suggests that Anne not only read scripture, but discussed it with learned men, engaging with theological questions in a way that was unusual for medieval queens. Throughout all these years, from their marriage in 1382 until Anne's death in 1394, a period of 12 years, one thing did not happen that everyone expected and hoped for. Anne never gave birth to a child. In medieval royal marriages, producing heirs was perhaps the single most important duty of a queen. The entire dynastic system depended on legitimate royal children to inherit thrones and continue royal lines. A childless marriage was considered a failure, and a childless queen had failed in her most essential function. The lack of children was a source of disappointment, speculation, and eventual concern. Various theories have been proposed over the centuries to explain why Richard and Anne had no children. Some historians have suggested that Anne was infertile due to some medical condition. Others have suggested that Richard was infertile or had some physical problem that prevented him from fathering children. Some have speculated that Richard was homosexual and that the marriage was never consummated, or was consummated only rarely. Others have suggested that Richard insisted on a celibate marriage to mirror the example of Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon king who was believed to have maintained a virgin marriage with his queen. More recent scholarship has suggested that Anne and Richard did attempt to have children, and that Anne may have suffered one or more miscarriages. A letter from Anne to her brother Wenceslaus, written around 1384, uses language that some scholars interpret as possibly referring to pregnancy complications. The historian Kirsten Gaiman has analysed this letter and noted the use of a Latin word related to childbirth, suggesting that Anne may have experienced a pregnancy loss. If true, this would indicate that Richard and Anne's marriage was physically consummated and that they hoped for children, but that those hopes were never fulfilled. Whatever the explanation, the lack of children created political problems. England needed an heir. If Richard died without children, the crown would pass to one of Edward III's other descendants, probably to one of Richard's uncles or cousins, which could lead to succession disputes and civil war. The nobility pressured Richard to produce an heir. There may have been whispered criticisms of Anne for failing in this fundamental queenly duty. Yet remarkably, the lack of children does not seem to have damaged Anne's reputation with ordinary people or lessened Richard's love for her. The Evesham chronicler wrote that this queen, although she did not bear children, was still held to have contributed to the glory and wealth of the realm, as far as she was able. Noble and common people suffered greatly at her death. Anne's epitaph specifically mentions that she was kind to pregnant women, which may be a poignant detail. Anne, who could not have children herself, was particularly compassionate toward women who could. The lack of children may actually have strengthened Richard and Anne's emotional bond. Without children to distract them or to compete for attention, they remained each other's primary companions. Their relationship was not primarily about producing heirs, but about genuine affection and partnership. In a world where royal marriages were typically loveless political arrangements, Richard and Anne seem to have found real companionship and love with each other. In early June of 1394, 12 years after her wedding, Anne was at Sheen Palace in Richmond with Richard. Sheen had become one of their favourite residences, a place where they could enjoy relative privacy away from the constant business and ceremony of Westminster. The palace was beautiful, situated on the Thames with gardens and parks, comfortable apartments, and a peaceful atmosphere. On June 5th, 1394, Anne fell suddenly ill. The illness came on quickly and was severe from the start. Medieval medicine had little understanding of infectious disease and almost no effective treatments. Physicians could diagnose based on symptoms, prescribe herbs or bloodletting, recommend prayers to particular saints. But for many diseases, especially infectious diseases, there was little that could be done. Anne's symptoms progressed rapidly. She had high fever, weakness, perhaps pain and difficulty breathing. Within hours, it was clear that this was serious. Richard was summoned to be at her bedside. Physicians attended her, but there was little they could do. Prayers were said. Anne received the last rites of the church, the final sacraments that prepared a Christian soul for death. For 3 days, Anne lingered between life and death, while Richard stayed at her bedside. We can imagine his anguish as he watched his beloved wife, still only 28 years old, slipping away from him. They had been married for 12 years. Anne had been his companion, his comfort, his closest friend. She had stood by him through the humiliations of the merciless Parliament, through the political crises of his reign, through all the difficulties and dangers they had faced together. And now she was dying, and there was nothing he could do to save her. On June 7th, 1394, Anne of Bohemia died at Sheen Palace. The cause was believed to be plague. Plague had never entirely left England after the Great Black Death of 1348. There were periodic outbreaks, and 1394 saw another such outbreak. The rapid onset of symptoms, the high fever, the quick death, all were consistent with plague. Some historians have questioned this diagnosis, noting that if Anne had died of highly contagious plague, her funeral would have needed to be immediate and simple to prevent disease spread. But instead, it was delayed for weeks and was extremely elaborate. Alternative diagnoses have been suggested, including ectopic pregnancy, which would explain sudden severe illness and rapid death in a woman of childbearing age. But without any detailed medical records or autopsy reports, the exact cause of Anne's death remains uncertain. What is certain is that she died suddenly, unexpectedly, at age 28, after a brief illness, and that her death devastated her husband. Richard's reaction to Anne's death was immediate, overwhelming, and extreme. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as wild with grief, utterly inconsolable, distraught in the aftermath. Richard had lost not only his wife but his closest companion, his advisor, his emotional anchor. Everything he had built his adult life around, his marriage to Anne, their partnership, their shared interests and affections, was suddenly gone. In his grief, Richard made a decision that shocked contemporaries. He ordered Sheen Palace to be completely destroyed, not just closed or abandoned, but demolished, razed to the ground. The beautiful palace where he and Anne had spent so many happy times, where she had died, was to be torn down so completely that Richard would never have to see it again and be reminded of his loss. The destruction of Sheen Palace was an extraordinary gesture. Royal palaces were valuable properties, expensive to build and maintain. To destroy one entirely out of grief was almost unheard of. But Richard could not bear the thought of ever entering the place where Anne had died. He also swore that he would not enter any building where he and Anne had lived together for a full year after her death, excepting only churches. This meant avoiding most of his favourite residences, removing himself from the physical spaces that held memories of Anne. Richard also ordered an elaborate funeral for Anne, one that would take months to prepare and would demonstrate to all England how much he had loved his queen. Every detail was to be perfect. Richard summoned all the great nobles of England and commanded them to attend with their wives. He ordered special candles to be imported from Flanders to light the funeral procession. Flemish candles were considered superior, and Richard wanted only the best for Anne's funeral. He commissioned the finest craftsmen to create an elaborate tomb where Anne's body would rest and where Richard himself would eventually be buried beside her. The funeral was delayed for nearly 2 months while these elaborate preparations were made. Anne's body was embalmed, a process that preserved it temporarily, and kept at Sheen while arrangements proceeded. Only in early August did the funeral procession finally begin. On August 3rd, 1394, Anne's coffin was carried from Sheen Palace to London in a grand procession. The coffin was accompanied by hundreds of mourners, all dressed in black, as was customary for funerals. The imported Flemish candles burned throughout the procession, their light visible for miles. The procession made its way first to Old St. Paul's Cathedral in London, where services were held, and then continued to Westminster Abbey. But the funeral itself was marred by an incident that revealed just how unstable Richard's grief had made him. Among the nobles summoned to attend was Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, one of the Lords Appellant, who had opposed Richard during the Merciless Parliament, and who had been involved in the execution of Simon Burley. Arundel had a long history of conflict with Richard, and Richard detested him. Arundel arrived late to the funeral procession, missing the journey from Sheen to London. When he finally appeared at Westminster Abbey, he compounded his offence by asking the king for permission to leave early before the funeral service was complete. This combination, arriving late and then asking to leave early from the funeral of the Queen, was incredibly disrespectful. Whether Arundel intended such disrespect or was simply thoughtless and arrogant, it sent Richard into a fury. Richard, consumed by grief and rage, seized a staff or wand from one of the vergers, officials who carried staffs as symbols of office, and struck Arundel violently on the head with it. The blow was so hard that Arundel fell to the ground, dazed and bleeding. The funeral service had to be stopped. Arundel was dragged out of the abbey. Blood spattered the abbey floor. It was a shocking scene. A king losing control so completely that he committed violence in a church during a funeral in front of hundreds of witnesses. Eventually, order was restored. The service continued, and Anne was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, near the shrine of Edward the Confessor. But the incident demonstrated how profoundly Anne's death had affected Richard's mental and emotional state. The young king, who had once shown courage and self-control during the Peasants' Revolt, who had matured into a capable ruler, was now capable of explosive, uncontrolled violence when consumed by grief. Richard had commissioned an elaborate double tomb for Anne and himself. The tomb was to be large enough for two effigies lying side by side, with clasped hands symbolizing their eternal union. He hired the finest craftsmen in England, Henry Yevele and Stephen Lotte, for the marble base, Nicholas Broker and Godfrey Prest for the gilded copper effigies. The effigies were to be remarkably lifelike portraits rather than idealized representations. The tomb that was created is one of the masterpieces of medieval English sculpture. The two effigies lie side by side, their right hands joined together for eternity, both crowned as king and queen, both holding scepters. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. You can see the details of their faces, their clothing, even the badges and symbols that were important to them. The inscription on the tomb describes Anne as beauteous in body, and her face was gentle and pretty, suggesting she was remembered for gentleness and kindness rather than overwhelming physical beauty. The tomb still stands in Westminster Abbey today, though it has suffered damage over the centuries. In 1871, the tomb was opened, and it was discovered that most of Anne's bones had been stolen over the years by relic hunters and souvenir seekers who had reached through a hole in the side of the tomb. Only a few bones remained, which were carefully rearranged by Dean Stanley. Anne's funeral effigy, a wooden head that had been carried in her funeral procession, survived and can be seen today in the Abbey's museum. After Anne's death, Richard's behavior became increasingly erratic and tyrannical. Historians have long debated whether Anne had truly been a moderating influence on Richard's personality, restraining his worst impulses, or whether his later behavior was simply the result of his growing determination to assert absolute royal power, combined with the trauma of losing Anne. Perhaps it was both. Anne's presence had provided emotional stability, and her loss removed that stabilizing influence, just as Richard was entering a phase of his reign where he was determined to take revenge on old enemies and assert his authority absolutely. In 1396, 2 years after Anne's death, Richard remarried. His second wife was Isabella of Valois, the 6-year-old daughter of King Charles VI of France. This marriage was purely political, part of a peace treaty with France. It was understood that the marriage would not be consummated until Isabella was much older, if ever, given Richard's own uncertain future. Richard seems to have been kind to the child queen, treating her almost as a daughter, giving her gifts, visiting her regularly at Windsor where she resided. But Isabella could not replace Anne in Richard's heart. In 1397, Richard finally took his revenge on the Lords Appellant, who had humiliated him during the merciless Parliament. He arrested Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, his own uncle, who died mysteriously in captivity, probably murdered on Richard's orders. He arrested Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, the same man who had arrived late to Anne's funeral and been struck by the grieving king, and had him tried and executed for treason. Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, was exiled. Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray were initially exiled, but would later play crucial roles in Richard's downfall. Richard increasingly acted as an absolute monarch, demanding complete obedience, punishing anyone he suspected of disloyalty, insisting that his subjects address him with exalted titles like Your Majesty, rather than the simpler Your Highness that had been customary. He raised taxes without parliamentary approval. He maintained a private army of Cheshire archers who served as his personal guard and enforcers. He became paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, trusting no one. This behavior alarmed the English nobility. They began to fear that Richard had become a tyrant, that no one's life or property was safe, that traditional English liberties and the balance between royal power and noble rights were being destroyed. When Richard exiled Henry Bolingbroke in 1398 and then seized the vast Duchy of Lancaster estates when Bolingbroke's father died, he created a powerful enemy who had nothing left to lose. In 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke invaded England with a small force, claiming he only wanted to recover his inheritance. But the English nobility rallied to Bolingbroke rather than to Richard. Richard returned from Ireland to find that his support had collapsed. He was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. In February 1400, Richard died in captivity, probably murdered, though some claimed he starved himself to death. Richard was initially buried at King's Langley in Hertfordshire, away from the elaborate tomb he had prepared at Westminster. But in 1413, King Henry V, the son of Henry IV, who had usurped Richard's throne, decided to atone for his father's sin by giving Richard a more honourable burial. Henry had Richard's body exhumed and brought to Westminster Abbey to be buried in the tomb that Richard himself had commissioned, beside his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia. Anne of Bohemia's legacy is complex and multifaceted. She died young, at 28, without children, without great political achievements, without military victories or territorial conquests. Yet she left a mark on English history and English memory that has lasted more than 6 centuries. First, and most importantly, she is remembered as Good Queen Anne, the merciful intercessor who pleaded for the lives of the condemned and who showed compassion to the poor and powerless. Her reputation for kindness and gentleness was her greatest achievement. In an age when power often meant cruelty, when justice was harsh, When the gap between rich and poor was vast, Anne's compassion stood out. She used what power she had to help rather than to exploit, to save lives rather than to advance her own interests. Second, Anne is remembered for her cultural contributions. She brought influences from the sophisticated court of Prague to England. She introduced or popularized the side saddle, making it more practical for noble women to ride independently. She made the horned headdress fashionable. She brought artistic and aesthetic sensibilities that enriched English court culture. The word coach may derive from her arrival in a carriage from the Hungarian town of Cox. Third, and perhaps most significantly for the long sweep of history, Anne is remembered for her role in early religious reform, her protection of John Wycliffe, her encouragement of biblical scholarship, her support for Bohemian students studying at Oxford. All of these contributed to the spread of reformist ideas. The chain of influence from Wycliffe to Hus to Luther shows how Anne's quiet support for religious learning had consequences that extended far beyond her lifetime and helped to shape the Protestant Reformation. Fourth, Anne is remembered for the love story between her and Richard. In an age when royal marriages were typically political transactions with little expectation of romantic love, Anne and Richard found something genuine and deep. Richard's extreme grief at her death, his destruction of Sheen Palace, his elaborate funeral preparations, his determination to be buried beside her, all testify to a love that was real and powerful. When Henry V reunited Richard and Anne in death, he was acknowledging the power of their bond. The contemporary chronicle's description of Henry's action captures this beautifully. And anon, the first year of his reign, for the great and tender love that he had to King Richard, he translated his body from Langley unto Westminster, and buried him beside Queen Anne, his first wife, as his desire was. Fifth, Anne is remembered as a reminder that historical significance does not always come from dramatic actions or great political achievements. Anne did not lead armies, did not rule kingdoms, did not negotiate treaties or win battles. She showed mercy, she protected scholars, she brought cultural influences, she loved her husband. These quieter contributions, compassion, learning, culture, love, have their own historical importance. They remind us that history is not only made by warriors and politicians, but also by those who act with kindness and humanity. The tomb of Anne and Richard in Westminster Abbey stands as a physical memorial to their story. Tourists and visitors can see their joined hands, their crowned heads, the elaborate craftsmanship that Richard commissioned. The inscription reminds us that Anne was beauteous in body and her face was gentle and pretty, a description that emphasizes not overwhelming beauty, but gentleness and prettiness, qualities that matched her character. The funeral effigy of Anne that survives in the Abbey's museum gives us perhaps our most accurate image of what she actually looked like. A small woman with delicate features, forever young at 28, the Bohemian princess who became good Queen Anne. Anne of Bohemia lived for only 28 years. She was Queen of England for only 12 years. She died suddenly of plague or illness, leaving no children, leaving a grieving husband whose mental state deteriorated after her death. Yet more than 600 years later, we still remember her. We remember her gentleness, her mercy, her compassion. We remember her as good Queen Anne, the beloved queen who died of plague, whose story reminds us that kindness and mercy are worth remembering, that love matters in history as much as power, that a life devoted to helping others has its own kind of greatness. As you drift off to sleep tonight, dear listener, let the story of Anne of Bohemia carry you gently into dreams. Imagine her walking through Prague Castle as a child, studying her precious manuscripts. Imagine her perilous journey across storm-tossed seas to England. Imagine her kneeling before Richard to plead for mercy for the condemned. Imagine her gentle voice reading scripture in 3 languages, her compassionate heart moved by the suffering of others, her love for the difficult young king who became her husband. Imagine them together in death as they were in life, their hands joined for eternity, their story preserved in stone and in memory. May the gentle spirit of good Queen Anne watch over your sleep. May her story of compassion and love bring you peaceful dreams, and may you wake refreshed, having travelled through time to walk a while with the imperial princess, who became England's most beloved queen. Sleep well, dear listener, until we meet again for another journey through history's gentle tales. Good night.